Welcome to NightSleepWhisper. As my voice guides you through this tale of betrayal, discovery, and rebirth, allow your mind to settle. Relax, take a deep breath, and walk alongside David Miller through those mysterious corridors beneath the sand. I wish you a peaceful journey and a very good night's sleep. David looked out the window of the old Jeep. Everything was orange. The sand covered the ground and the air. It was very hot. David was a structural engineer. He was 40 years of age and had many years of experience. His job was to check big buildings for problems. Today, his job was at Station Zero. Station Zero was a secret place. It was in the middle of a vast desert. No one lived near it. David was alone with the driver. The driver was a tall man with a beard. He did not speak. He just looked at the road and kept his hands on the wheel. "Are we close?" David asked. He had to speak loudly because the wind was strong. The driver pointed a finger. In the distance, David saw something. It was a large building. It was made of grey metal and thick glass. It looked like a giant iron box sitting on the sand. There were no trees and no grass. Only the metal station stood against the empty horizon. The wind started to blow faster. Small rocks hit the side of the Jeep. The sky turned dark and grey. A massive sandstorm was coming. David felt a little bit of fear. He did not like the desert. It was too big and too quiet. The Jeep stopped in front of a giant metal gate. There was a camera above the gate. It moved and looked at David. After a moment, a green light flashed. The gate opened. David grabbed his bag. He opened the door of the Jeep. The heat hit his face. It felt like opening a hot oven. He ran to the main entrance. A voice came from a speaker on the wall. "State your name and your business," the voice said. It was a woman's voice. She sounded very serious. "I am David Miller. I am the engineer," he replied. He wiped the sand from his eyes. The heavy door opened. David walked inside quickly. He was covered in dust. He saw a woman standing in the lobby. She wore a clean white coat and had her hair in a tight bun. This was Sarah, the station manager. She looked at David's boots and then at his face. "Welcome to Station Zero," Sarah said. She did not smile. "You arrived just in time. The storm is here. It will be very bad." She closed the door behind him. The sound of the wind stopped immediately. Now, the station was very quiet. The air inside was cool. It smelled like plastic and cleaning chemicals. David looked around the lobby. There were no windows. There were only white walls and bright lights on the ceiling. "The station is very deep," Sarah explained. "Most of the rooms are under the sand. You are here to check the walls and the floor. We had some small vibrations last week. I want to be sure the building is safe." David nodded. He felt nervous. He was a professional, but this place felt strange. It was too clean and too silent. "Where is the rest of the team?" David asked. "They are working in the laboratory," Sarah said. "We do not waste time here. Follow me." David walked behind her. His boots made a clicking sound on the hard floor. He looked back at the entrance. He knew he could not leave until the storm ended. He was trapped in the desert with people he did not know. He looked at his watch. It was only 3 o'clock in the afternoon, but it felt like midnight. Sarah led David down a long, white corridor. The ceiling was low. Every few meters, a small camera watched them from the corner. David felt like he was being measured. At the end of the hall, they stopped in front of a massive door. It was made of dark, brushed iron. It did not have a handle. Instead, it had a small glass screen on the wall next to it. "This is the inner gate," Sarah said. She stood in front of the screen. A blue light scanned her eyes. A second later, the heavy door moved to the side. It made a deep, metallic sliding sound that echoed through the hall. Beyond this point, security is very strict. You must follow the rules at all times. David stepped through the gate. The air here felt different. It was colder and very dry. Sarah reached into her pocket and handed David a small plastic card. It was a security badge with his name and a blurry photo of his face. "Keep this with you always," she warned him. "Without this badge, the doors will not open. You will be trapped in a room alone until I find you. Also, do not try to use your phone. There is no signal here. We use a private internal system for all communication." David looked at the badge. "I understand. What about the restricted areas? You mentioned vibrations in the floor. Where are they strongest?" Sarah paused. She looked at the iron gate as it closed behind them. "The vibrations are mostly in level 3. That is where the energy core is located. However, you are not allowed to go there yet. First, I will show you the living quarters and the common room. You need to rest and eat after your journey." They walked past several glass windows. Inside, David saw people in blue jumpsuits. They were all adults, mostly in their 40s or 50s. They were looking at large computer screens and talking in low voices. No one looked up as David and Sarah passed. The station felt like a machine where every person was a small, quiet part. "The rules are simple," Sarah continued. "Breakfast is at 7. Lunch is at 12. Dinner is at 7. Do not enter any room with a red light above the door. If you hear a long whistle from the speakers, it means there is a problem with the air pressure. In that case, stay where you are and wait for instructions." David nodded, but he had many questions. Why is there so much security for a structural check? Sarah stopped and turned to face him. Her eyes were sharp. "We are working on a very important project, Mr. Miller. It is worth a lot of money. There are people who want to steal our secrets. My job is to make sure that does not happen." She pointed to a door at the end of the hall. "That is your room. Put your bags inside. When you are ready, come to the common room for tea. The other scientists are there now. It is time for you to meet the team." David entered his room. It was small and grey. There was a bed, a desk, and a lamp. There were no windows to see the desert. He sat on the bed and listened. He could hear a low, constant hum coming from the walls. It was the sound of the station breathing. He felt a long way from home. David walked down the white hallway. He followed the signs to the common room. The air was very dry. When he entered, the room was bright. There was a large table and some metal chairs. 3 people sat there. Sarah was one of them. She stood up when she saw David. "David, come in," she said. "Meet the team." The first person was an older man with grey hair. He wore a dark blue suit. He looked very tired. "This is Dr. Aries," Sarah said. "He is the lead scientist." Dr. Aries stood up and shook David's hand. His hand was cold. "Welcome, Mr. Miller. I hope you find the station strong. We are doing very sensitive work here. Any vibration is a problem for my machines." "What kind of machines?" David asked. Dr. Aries pointed to a large glass wall at the back of the room. Behind the glass was a massive laboratory. It was filled with tall metal towers and long cables. Everything was white and silver. Scientists in white suits moved slowly between the machines. They did not speak to each other. They used hand signals or looked at tablets. "We call it the silent laboratory," Dr. Aries explained. "The energy project is very delicate. Sound and movement can change the results. That is why everyone must be quiet." David looked at the lab. It was impressive. He saw a blue light glowing in the center of the room. It was beautiful but strange. He could not hear anything from behind the glass. It was like watching a silent movie. The second person at the table was a man with a short beard and glasses. He stayed in his chair. "This is Dr. Thomas," Sarah said. "He is our medical doctor. He keeps us healthy." Dr. Thomas looked at David. His eyes were small and dark. "The desert is a hard place for the body, Mr. Miller," he said. "Drink a lot of water. And stay away from the cooling fans. They are dangerous." The third person was a younger woman with short hair. She was typing on a small computer. "And this is Maya," Sarah added. "She is our systems expert. She controls the station's computer." Maya did not look up. She just raised a hand to say hello. She seemed very busy. Her fingers moved quickly across the keys. David sat down. Sarah gave him a cup of hot tea. "We are a small group," she said. "We stay here for months at a time. We are like a family, but we are also professionals." David looked around the room. The scientists were all adults. They looked serious and focused. But he noticed something strange. No one was looking at each other. They all looked at their tea, their books, or their computers. It was a very quiet family. There was no laughter and no friendly talk. "The project is almost finished," Dr. Aries said. He looked at the blue light in the lab. "Once it is done, the world will change. But until then, we must be careful. Very careful." David felt the weight of the secret. He was just an engineer, but he was now part of something big. He looked at the people at the table. He wondered if they really trusted each other. In the desert, silence was common. But this silence felt heavy, like a storm waiting to happen. Outside, the sand continued to hit the walls. Inside, the mystery was just beginning. David lay on his narrow bed. The room was dark, but he could not sleep. The station was too quiet. He could hear the low, steady hum of the air system. It was a deep sound that felt like it was inside his head. Outside, the desert wind continued to push sand against the thick metal walls. It sounded like 1,000 tiny fingers scratching at the building. He looked at his watch. The glowing numbers showed it was 2:15 a.m. Everyone was in their rooms. Or at least, they were supposed to be. David thought about the people he met at dinner. Dr. Aries was tired. Dr. Thomas was cold and distant. Maya was busy. Sarah was very strict. None of them seemed happy. Suddenly, a change in the light caught his eye. A bright red glow appeared under his door. It was pulsing slowly. 1 second the room was dark. The next second it was bathed in a deep, bloody red. David sat up quickly. He waited for a loud siren or a bell. But there was no sound. It was a silent alarm. He stood up and walked to the door. He opened it slowly. The long, white corridor was now a tunnel of red light. The emergency lights on the ceiling were flashing in a rhythmic pattern. David stepped out into the hall. The air felt colder now. "Hello," he whispered. No one answered. He started to walk toward the common room. He kept his back against the wall. He was not a security guard, but he felt he had to check. He remembered what Dr. Thomas said about the cooling fans. They were at the end of the western hall. David turned the corner and stopped. He saw a figure at the far end of the hallway. It was an adult, tall and thin, wearing dark clothes. The person was moving fast. They did not look back. The figure reached a large metal door with a sign that said, "Cooling system, danger." David wanted to shout, but his throat felt dry. He watched as the person used a security badge on the wall. The green light flashed, and the heavy door opened. The person slipped inside. A second later, the door clicked shut. David ran down the hallway. His heart was beating fast in his chest. When he reached the door, He looked at the small glass window. Inside, he could see the giant fans spinning. They were huge, silver blades that moved the air for the entire station. They made a deep roaring sound that he could feel through the floor. He looked for the person, but the room was full of shadows and metal pipes. The figure was gone. David tried to open the door, but it was locked. He placed his own security badge against the scanner. "Access denied," a computer voice said. It was a calm, female voice. David felt a chill that was not from the air conditioning. Someone was inside the cooling room, and they did not want to be seen. He looked at the red lights in the hallway. Why was the alarm silent? And why was his badge not working for this door? He decided to find Sarah. He turned around and began to walk back, but he stopped. He heard footsteps behind him. They were soft, quick steps on the metal floor. David turned his head, but the hallway was empty. Only the red lights continued to flash over and over in the silence of the night. The next morning, the red lights were gone. The station looked normal again. The white walls were bright under the ceiling lamps. David walked to the common room for breakfast. He felt very tired. He thought about the person he saw in the hallway last night. He wanted to tell Sarah about the cooling room. When he entered the room, Maya and Dr. Thomas were already there. Maya was drinking coffee and looking at her tablet. Dr. Thomas was eating a piece of dry toast. Sarah walked in a moment later. She looked at her watch and then at the empty chair at the head of the table. "Where is Dr. Aries?" Sarah asked. She looked at the door. "He is never late. He likes to eat at exactly 7 o'clock. "Maybe he is sleeping," Dr. Thomas said. He did not look up from his toast. The storm was loud last night. It kept many people awake. Sarah shook her head. "No. Dr. Aries is a very disciplined man. He does not sleep late." She looked at David. "Did you see him this morning?" "No," David said. He decided to speak. "But I saw something last night. There was a red light in the hall. A silent alarm. I saw someone go into the cooling room." Sarah stopped moving. She stared at David. "A silent alarm. The system did not report an alarm to my room. And the cooling room is restricted. Only Dr. Aries and I have the key for that door." Maya looked up from her tablet. Her face was pale. "I will check the computer logs," she said. She began to type very fast. "Wait," Sarah said. "First, we check on Dr. Aries. Follow me." They walked quickly down the hall to the residential wing. They stopped in front of a door with a silver nameplate. "Dr. Aries, lead scientist." Sarah knocked on the door. There was no answer. She knocked again, harder this time. The only sound was the low hum of the station. "Dr. Aries." "It is Sarah. Please open the door," she called out. Still, there was no sound from inside. Sarah reached for the door handle. She gasped. The handle was not straight. The heavy metal was bent downward, and there were deep scratches in the paint. It looked like someone had used a heavy tool to force the door. Sarah used her master key. The door opened with a long, scraping sound against the floor. They all stepped inside. The room was cold. The office was a mess. Books were on the floor. A chair was knocked over. The small desk in the corner was empty, but a lamp was still on. It cast a yellow light over the chaos. David looked at the bed. The blankets were pulled back, but the bed was empty. Dr. Aries was not there. "He is gone," Maya whispered. She looked around the room with fear in her eyes. David walked to the desk. He saw a small piece of glass on the floor. It looked like it came from a pair of spectacles. He also noticed that the computer on the desk was missing. There were only some cut wires where the machine used to be. "Someone took him," David said. He looked at the damaged door. And they were very strong. Look at the metal. This was not a simple exit. This was a struggle. Sarah stood in the middle of the room. She looked at the empty space where the lead scientist should be. The station felt even more silent than before. Outside, the desert was calm, but inside, the mystery was growing. Their leader was missing, and the only person who knew the secrets of the energy project was gone. Sarah led the group out of Dr. Aris's messy office. Her face was very serious. They walked quickly to the security hub. This was Maya's area. The room was filled with large computer screens. The screens showed different parts of the station. David saw the dining room, the hallways, and the entrance gate. Everything looked quiet and normal on the monitors. "Maya, I need to see the footage from last night," Sarah said. Her voice was sharp. "David saw someone near the cooling room at 2 o'clock. And we need to see who entered Dr. Aris's room." Maya sat in her chair. Her fingers moved like lightning across the keyboard. "I am opening the files now," she said. She looked focused. "I will start with the hallway outside the lead scientist's office." On the main screen, a video appeared. It showed the hallway from last night. The clock on the screen said 1:30 a.m. The hallway was empty. Maya pressed a button to make the video go faster. Suddenly, the screen turned black. "What happened?" David asked. He stepped closer to the monitor. Maya frowned. "That is strange. Let me check the other cameras." She clicked through the files for the cooling room and the main lab. Every video for that time was the same. The screen was black and empty. "The cameras stopped working at exactly 2 o'clock, Maya whispered. "They stayed black for 30 minutes. They started recording again at 2:30. "Did the power fail?" Dr. Thomas asked. He stood by the door with his arms crossed. "No," Maya replied. She shook her head. "If the power fails, the backup system starts. The cameras never stop. This was not an accident. Someone deleted the files." Sarah looked at the black screen. "Can you get them back? Can you find the ghost who did this?" Maya sighed. She looked at the code on her screen. "It is very difficult. The person used a master password. They did not just hide the video. They erased the digital memory. Only 3 people have that password: Dr. Aris, you, and me." The room became very cold. David looked at Sarah, then at Maya. If Dr. Aris was the victim, then the person who erased the video was in this room. "I did not do it," Sarah said quickly. She looked at David. "I was in my room. I was sleeping. I was in the computer hub until midnight," Maya said. "Then I went to bed. I have a digital lock on my door. It shows I did not leave my room until 6 in the morning." David remembered the figure he saw in the red light. The person was tall. They moved with confidence. "The person I saw knew exactly where they were going," David said. "They had a security badge. They used it to open the cooling room door. But my badge did not work there." "That is because the cooling room is a level 4 area," Sarah explained. "Your badge is only level 2. This means the person is a senior member of the station." Maya typed one last command. A small message appeared on the screen in red letters. "File permanently removed." "The digital ghost left no footprints," Maya said. "The footage is gone forever." David looked at the screens. He felt like someone was watching them right now through one of the cameras. The station was a circle of secrets. Dr. Aris was gone, the evidence was erased, and the person responsible was walking among them, pretending to be worried. The silence in the security hub was too much for David. He needed to move. He needed to breathe different air. He looked at Sarah. Her face was tight with worry. "I'm going to the garage," David said. "Maybe Dr. Aris tried to leave. Maybe he is in the jeep." Sarah looked surprised. "The storm is still blowing, David. It is dangerous outside." "The wind is slower now," David replied. "I saw the monitors. The sand is not flying as fast. I want to check the only way out of this place." Sarah hesitated, but then she nodded. "Take a heavy coat and a radio. If the wind gets strong again, come back immediately." David walked to the airlock near the main entrance. He put on a thick, grey coat and pulled the hood over his head. He stepped into the small chamber. The first door closed, and the second door opened. The heat of the desert hit him, even though it was still early. The world outside was a different color. Everything was covered in a thick layer of orange dust. The sky was a pale, sickly yellow. David stepped onto the sand. It was soft and deep, like walking through heavy snow. Every step was a struggle. He moved toward the area where the driver parked the Jeep yesterday. He saw a large mound of sand. It was the shape of a vehicle. David reached the mound and started to push the sand away with his hands. The sand was hot and gritty. After a few minutes, he saw the silver metal of the Jeep. He cleared the driver's side window. The glass was empty. No one was inside. He opened the door. The interior was clean, but there was a layer of dust on the dashboard. He looked for the keys, but the ignition was empty. David then walked to the front of the vehicle. He pulled the lever and lifted the heavy metal hood. He stopped and stared. David was an engineer. He knew how machines worked. The engine of the Jeep was a mess. It was not because of the sand. Someone had used a pair of sharp metal cutters. The thick black wires that connected the battery to the engine were in pieces. The fuel line was also cut. Green liquid dripped slowly onto the orange sand. "No," David whispered to himself. "This was not an accident. The storm did not do this. A person did this. They wanted to make sure the Jeep was useless. They wanted to make sure no one could leave Station Zero." He heard a sound behind him. He turned quickly, his heart racing. It was Sarah. She was struggling through the sand to reach him. She looked at the engine and then at David. She did not need to ask. The damage was easy to see. "The wires are cut," David said. His voice was flat. "We are not going anywhere. The driver is gone, the Jeep is broken, and the sand is covering everything." Sarah touched the cut wires. "This means the person who took Dr. Aries is still here. They trapped us. We are in a cage made of sand and metal." David looked at the horizon. The desert was vast and empty. There were no other buildings for hundreds of miles. He felt very small. He realized that the mystery of the missing scientist was now a fight for their own lives. Someone at the station was a ghost, a thief, and now, a jailer. David and Sarah walked back into the station. They were covered in orange dust. Sarah closed the heavy airlock door. The lock felt final. They were now truly trapped. They walked to the common room to tell the others about the Jeep. Maya and Dr. Thomas were waiting. They looked nervous. "The Jeep is dead," David said as he took off his heavy coat. "The wires are cut. We cannot drive away from here." Dr. Thomas stood up quickly. "This is getting worse. First the doctor, then the cameras, and now the transport. We need to call the main office again." "The radio is still silent," Maya said. Her voice was thin. "I'm trying to fix it, but the signal is blocked by the storm. Or maybe something else." Suddenly, a small light on the kitchen wall began to flash. It was a yellow light. Under the light, a small screen showed a number, 15%. Sarah ran to the screen. Her face turned white. "This is the water monitor," she whispered. "The main tank was full this morning. It should be at 90%. Maybe there is a hole in the tank because of the vibrations." David asked. He was an engineer, so he thought about the building first. No, Sarah replied. The tank is made of thick steel. A small vibration cannot break it. We must go to the utility room. The utility room was in the lowest part of the station. It was dark and smelled like wet metal. David led the way with a bright flashlight. The beam of light moved across the floor. He saw a puddle of water. Then, he saw a stream of water flowing across the concrete. They followed the water to the back of the room. There sat the giant silver tank. At the bottom of the tank was a large red valve. It was the main drain. Usually, the valve was closed and locked with a heavy chain. David pointed his light at the valve. The chain was on the floor. It was not broken. It was opened with a key. The red handle of the valve was turned all the way to the left. Water was pouring out of the tank and into a drain in the floor. Someone opened it, David said. He reached down and turned the heavy handle back to the right. He had to use all his strength. Finally, the water stopped flowing. How much did we lose? Dr. Thomas asked. He looked at the wet floor with wide eyes. Too much, Sarah said. She looked at the small monitor on the wall. The number was now 12%. In this heat, we need water to survive. We also need water to cool the energy project. If the project gets too hot, the whole station is in danger. David looked at the chain on the floor. Who has the key to this valve? I do, Sarah said. She reached into her pocket. She pulled out a ring of keys. She looked at them for a long time. But my keys were on my nightstand while I slept. Anyone could have taken them. The group stood in the dark, wet room. The only sound was the drip of water hitting the floor. David looked at the three adults with him. One of them was a liar. One of them wanted them to be thirsty and trapped. The desert was outside, but the real danger was standing right next to him. They returned to the common room. Their shoes were still wet from the utility room. The air in the station felt warmer now because the cooling system was working slowly to save power. Everyone sat at the large table. No one spoke. They all looked at the water monitor. The number was still low. Sarah stood up. She looked at the bookshelf against the wall. She wanted to find a manual for the water system. Maybe there was a way to get water from the backup tanks. She pulled a large, green book from the shelf. It was a book about desert plants. As she moved the book, a folded piece of paper fell out and landed on the floor. David reached down and picked it up. "What is this?" he asked. He opened the paper slowly. It was a map. It was not a professional map from a computer. It was drawn by hand with a black pen. The lines were shaky but very detailed. David put the paper on the table so everyone could see. "This is the station," Sarah said. She pointed to different parts of the drawing. She saw the kitchen, the main laboratory, and the residential rooms. "But look here." She pointed to a corner of the map near the back of the kitchen. There was a small door drawn behind the big metal shelves. Next to the door, someone wrote 2 words in capital letters. "Secret exit." A secret exit? David asked. He shook his head. "I am a structural engineer. I looked at the official blueprints of this building before I came here. There is no exit in the kitchen. There are only the main airlock and the emergency hatches in the roof." "The paper looks a bit old," Maya said. She leaned in to look at the ink. "The edges are yellow. Maybe someone who worked here many years ago drew this. Or maybe someone who is here now," Dr. Thomas added. He looked at the map with suspicion. "Why is it hidden in a book about plants? Who reads that?" David looked at the handwriting. It was small and very neat. He remembered the empty office of Dr. Aries. He remembered the notes on the desk. "This handwriting, it looks like Dr. Aries's writing," David said quietly. Sarah touched the paper. "If Dr. Aries knew about a secret exit, why didn't he tell me? I am the manager of Station Zero. I should know every door, every pipe, and every wire in this building. Maybe he did not trust the official exits, David suggested. Maybe he was afraid that someone would block the main doors, like the way someone cut the wires in the Jeep. The group looked at each other. The common room felt smaller and more dangerous. They were in a building full of hidden drawings and missing people. David felt a spark of hope, but he also felt nervous. If the map was real, they could leave. But if the map was a trick, they were walking into a dark place with no way out. We need to check the kitchen, David said. He stood up. We need to find out if that door is real. Sarah nodded. She held the map tightly in her hand. Her fingers were shaking just a little bit. Let's go. But stay close together. We do not know who is watching us from the shadows. The group walked into the kitchen. The room was large and full of cold metal tables. The smell of old food and cleaning spray was in the air. David went straight to the back of the room. He saw the big metal shelves. They were full of heavy cans of food and boxes of water. The map says the door is behind these shelves, David said. He pointed to the wall. That is impossible, Sarah said. She crossed her arms. That is a solid concrete wall. There is nothing behind it but desert sand. David did not listen. He grabbed the side of the shelf. Help me move this, he told Dr. Thomas. The doctor hesitated, but then he grabbed the other side. They pulled together. The heavy metal shelf moved slowly. Dust flew into the air. When the shelf was away from the wall, David used his flashlight. He looked at the white surface. It was smooth. There was no door. There was not even a small crack. See? Sarah said. Her voice was loud and angry. The map is a lie. It is a joke from Dr. Aries. Or maybe it is a trick from you, David. David turned around. A trick from me. I just arrived yesterday. I did not draw this map. How do we know? Dr. Thomas asked. He stepped back and looked at David with suspicion. You are an engineer. You know how buildings work. Maybe you are here to steal the project files. Maybe you are the one who took Dr. Aries. That is crazy, David said. He looked at Maya. Maya, you know the security. You saw me arrive. Maya looked at the floor. She did not look at David. I don't know anything anymore. The cameras were erased. The computer says everything is fine, but our leader is missing. Maybe David is right. Or maybe Dr. Thomas is right. And what about you, Maya? Sarah shouted. You are the only one who can delete the video files. Did you do it? Are you working for another company? Maya's face turned red. I work harder than anyone here. I stay in that computer room all night. You are the manager, Sarah. You lost your keys. You let the water out of the tank. The room was full of shouting. Everyone was pointing fingers. The family of scientists was gone. Now, they were just 4 adults in a small room, full of fear and hate. David watched them. He saw the anger in Sarah's eyes. He saw the cold look on the doctor's face. He saw Maya's shaking hands. Stop! David yelled. His voice echoed off the metal tables. The person who did this is happy right now. They want us to fight. They want us to stay in this kitchen and scream while they finish their plan. The shouting stopped. The room became very quiet. But the silence was not friendly. It was a cold, sharp silence. David looked at each person. He realized something very important. He was an outsider. He did not know these people. Sarah could be a liar. Dr. Thomas could be a thief. Maya could be a ghost in the system. He was in the middle of a desert, trapped in a metal box, and he could not trust a single person in the room. "We are going to our rooms," Sarah said finally. Her voice was low and cold. "We will lock the doors. We will wait for the morning. Do not leave your room for any reason." David watched them leave. He stood alone in the kitchen. He looked at the blank wall behind the shelf. He felt like the station was watching him. He was not just an engineer anymore. He was a man in a trap. David did not go to sleep. He sat on the edge of his bed and looked at the grey wall. The air in his room felt heavy. He could not stop thinking about the shouting in the kitchen. He did not trust Sarah, and he did not trust the doctor. He felt that the only way to be safe was to get help from the outside world. "I need to check the radio," David whispered to himself. He knew Sarah told everyone to stay in their rooms. But David was an engineer. He knew that sometimes a machine could be fixed even if it looked broken. He opened his door very slowly. The hallway was dark. The red emergency lights were off, but the ceiling lamps were very dim. He walked quietly toward the communication room. The communication room was near the main entrance. It was a small room full of black boxes and long antennas that went up through the roof. David pushed the door. It was not locked. He walked inside and turned on his flashlight. The light moved across the table. David stopped and his breath caught. The long-range radio was on the floor. It was a heavy, expensive machine. But now it was in pieces. The front glass was smashed. The buttons were missing. David knelt down to look at the damage. He was a professional, and he saw something very important. The wires at the back of the radio were not just pulled out. They were cut. The cuts were very clean and straight. A professional tool did this, David thought. A wire cutter from a toolkit. He felt a cold shiver. He had a toolkit in his room. Sarah had a toolkit in her office. Maya also had tools for the computers. This was not a random act of anger. This was a careful plan. The person wanted to make sure no one could talk to the world outside the desert. David looked at the broken glass. He saw a small drop of something on the table. He moved his light closer. It was a drop of dark blue ink. He remembered seeing a blue pen in Dr. Thomas's pocket earlier that day. Was the doctor here? Suddenly, the door behind him moved. David turned his flashlight off quickly and hid behind a large metal cabinet. He held his breath. He heard the sound of footsteps on the floor. Someone was in the room. The person did not turn on the lights. David heard a small metallic click. Then, he heard the sound of someone moving the broken pieces of the radio. The person stayed for a minute, then they walked out of the room and closed the door. David waited for a long time in the dark. His heart was beating very fast. When he was sure the person was gone, he stood up. He realized that the station was no longer a place of science. It was a place of shadows. Every person was a suspect. He looked at the broken radio one last time. There was no way to fix it. They were truly alone in the sand. He had to find another way to survive. He thought about the map in the book. Even if the kitchen wall looked solid, he had to check it again. It was their only hope. David did not go back to his room. Instead, he went back to the kitchen. He was careful to stay in the shadows. He did not want to meet the mysterious person from the radio room again. When he reached the kitchen, he saw a light moving inside. He stopped and waited. The light was small. It was a flashlight. He saw a person standing by the big metal shelves. It was Sarah. She was wearing her white coat, and she looked very tired. She was touching the wall with her hands. "Sarah." David whispered. Sarah jumped and turned around. She held her flashlight up to David's face. "David, you scared me. Why are you not in your room?" "I could not sleep," David said. He walked toward her. "I went to the radio room. It is destroyed, Sarah. Someone used professional tools to cut the wires. I think we are in real danger. Sarah lowered her flashlight. Her face was pale. I know. I feel it too. That is why I came back here. I cannot stop thinking about the map. Dr. Aries was a very smart man. He did not play jokes. If he drew a door on a map, there is a door. David looked at the white wall again. He was an engineer. He knew that sometimes things were not what they seemed. He knelt down on the floor and looked at the bottom of the wall. He moved his flashlight slowly along the edge where the wall met the floor. Look at this, David said. Sarah knelt next to him. David pointed at a thin, dark line in the floor. It was a scratch, but it was a perfect circle. It looked like something heavy moved over the floor many times. This wall does not just sit there, David explained. It moves. But it does not slide. It rotates. David stood up. He began to push different parts of the wall. He pushed the top, then the middle. Nothing happened. Then, he looked at the metal shelf they moved earlier. On the wall, there was a small metal hook for hanging pots. It looked old and rusty. David grabbed the hook and pulled it. It did not move. Then, he tried to turn it. He turned it to the right. He heard a heavy metallic click behind the concrete. Suddenly, the wall began to move. It did not sound like a door. It sounded like heavy gears turning deep underground. The section of the wall, about 1 meter wide, pushed backward and then swung open like a giant, heavy gate. Behind the wall, there was no sand. There was a dark, narrow staircase made of cold iron. It went down into the earth, far below the floor of the kitchen. A cold, damp wind blew up from the hole. It smelled like old metal and electricity. The secret basement, Sarah whispered. Her voice was full of wonder and fear. The official plans say there is nothing below level 3. But this goes much deeper. David checked his flashlight. The batteries were strong. He looked at Sarah. We have to go down. Maybe Dr. Aries is down there. Maybe the person who is doing this is down there too. Sarah nodded. She took a deep breath and stepped onto the first iron stair. I am the manager of this station. I need to know what is happening in my building. They started to walk down. The stairs were steep and slippery. Every step made a low, ringing sound. As they went deeper, the temperature dropped. They were leaving the desert behind and entering a world of secrets. The iron stairs felt endless. David and Sarah continued to walk down into the dark. The walls here were not white and clean like the station above. They were made of rough, grey stone and cold metal. Small drops of water ran down the walls. David held the flashlight steady. The beam of light moved over the stairs, showing the way. It is so cold here, Sarah whispered. She wrapped her arms around her body. She was shivering. The temperature is very low, David agreed. He could see a small cloud of white mist every time he breathed out. This is not normal for a basement. This is a special cooling system. They reached the bottom of the stairs. There was a thick, heavy door made of silver metal. It looked like the door of a giant refrigerator. David reached for the handle. It felt like a piece of ice. He pulled it with all his strength. The door opened slowly. A wave of freezing air hit their faces. David stepped inside and moved his flashlight around the room. Both he and Sarah gasped at the same time. The room was large and filled with rows of tall, black metal cabinets. These were computer servers. Hundreds of small blue and green lights were blinking in the dark. The machines made a low, constant whirring sound. Long black cables ran across the ceiling like sleeping snakes. I don't understand, Sarah said. She walked between the rows of machines. I am the manager of Station 0. I know every computer we have. These are not our servers. They are not on the official station map. They are not connected to our main system. David knelt down to look at the cables. He saw that the wires did not go up to the station. Instead, they went deep into the floor. These machines are doing a lot of work. They are very hot, which is why the room must stay freezing cold. But what are they doing? He found a small desk in the corner of the room. There was a single computer monitor on the desk. David pressed a button on the keyboard. The screen came to life. It showed thousands of rows of numbers and codes. The data was moving very fast. "This is not energy research," David said. He looked at the screen closely. "This is encryption. These machines are breaking codes or hiding secrets. Someone is using this hidden room to send data out of the desert without anyone knowing." Sarah looked at the blinking lights with a mix of anger and fear. Dr. Aries must have known. This room is right below his office. But did he build this, or was he trying to stop it? David looked around the floor. Near the desk, he saw a small, dark object. He picked it up. It was a pair of glasses. They were broken. One of the glass lenses was missing. "These belong to Dr. Aries," David said. He held the glasses up in the flashlight beam. "He was here. And there was a fight." Sarah touched one of the cold server cabinets. "This means the person who took him is using these machines. We are standing in the middle of a giant lie. David. The station is just a cover for this room." Suddenly, the blue lights on the servers changed. They all turned bright red at the same time. The whirring sound of the fans became much louder. The machines were working harder now. It felt like the room was waking up. The red lights from the servers made the room look like it was on fire. The air was still freezing, but David felt a bead of sweat on his forehead. The loud noise of the fans made it hard to think. He looked at the small desk again. If Dr. Aries was here, he must have left something more than just his glasses. David pulled the drawers of the desk. The first two were empty. The third drawer was locked. David did not have a key, but he was an engineer. He looked around the floor and found a small, sharp piece of metal. He used the metal to turn the lock. After a few seconds, the drawer opened. Inside the drawer, there was a small, black notebook. It was made of leather and looked very old. David picked it up. He opened the first page. The handwriting was small and neat. It was definitely the writing of Dr. Aries. "Look at this," David said to Sarah. He held the notebook so they could both see it in the flashlight beam. The first few pages were about science. There were drawings of energy waves and math problems. But as David turned the pages, the notes changed. They were no longer about the project. They were about the people in the station. One page had a date from last week. It said, "I saw someone in the lab at midnight. They were not working. They were copying files. I think there is a traitor among us." Sarah gasped. "A traitor?" He knew someone was stealing the data. David turned to the next page. It was written in a hurry. The letters were messy. "I tried to change the passwords, but the system is blocking me. Maya says the computer is fine, but I do not believe her. Is she the one? Or is it Dr. Thomas? He asks too many questions about the encryption keys." He suspected Maya and the doctor, David whispered. The last page was the most frightening. It was dated yesterday. "The manager, Sarah, lost her keys today. She says it was an accident. I do not think so. I think she is helping the thief. I'm going to the hidden server room tonight to stop the data transfer. If I do not return, the truth is in this notebook." Sarah stepped back. Her face was full of pain. "He thought I was the traitor. I have worked for him for 10 years. I would never hurt him." David looked at Sarah. He wanted to believe her, but the notebook was very clear. Dr. Aries did not trust anyone. He felt like he was in a house full of enemies. David looked at the rows of red lights. The machines were sending the secret data right now. Wait, David said. He looked at the bottom of the page. There was one more sentence. The traitor has a secret partner outside the station. They are waiting for the storm to end. Suddenly, they heard a noise. It was not the fans. It was the sound of the heavy iron door at the top of the stairs. Someone was closing it. Run! David shouted. They ran to the iron stairs, but it was too late. They heard the loud sound of the lock turning. The heavy wall in the kitchen was now closed and locked from the other side. They were trapped in the freezing cold room with the secret servers and the red lights. David and Sarah stood in the smoke, their hearts racing. The cold from the basement was still in their bones, but the heat of the fire was pressing against their faces. David reached into his pocket and felt the hard edges of Dr. Ariz's notebook. He looked at Maya, then at Dr. Thomas. Both of them looked like heroes who had just saved the station from a disaster. But David knew the truth. The fire was not a disaster. It was a cleanup. "We found the basement," David said. His voice was steady and loud enough to cut through the fading sound of the siren. "We found the secret servers. And we found Dr. Ariz's notebook." The room became very quiet. Even the sound of the dripping water and the crackling of the dying fire seemed to stop. Maya lowered the fire extinguisher. The white foam dripped from the nozzle. Dr. Thomas took a step back, his eyes moving quickly from David to Sarah. "The notebook says there is a traitor," Sarah added. Her voice was no longer quiet. It was sharp with anger. "It says someone here was stealing data and sending it to the outside world. Someone who wanted to hide their tracks by locking us in the cold and burning this room to the ground." Maya looked at the broken server. "David, I was trying to stop the transfer," she whispered. Her hands were shaking. "I saw the signals in the computer room. I didn't tell you because I didn't know who to trust. I thought the fire was an accident caused by the system overload." "An accident?" David pointed to the smashed lock on the door. The lock was broken from the outside. This was an execution of a plan. Someone wanted the project gone so no one could see what was actually being sent through those hidden servers. Suddenly, the station's main lights flickered and died. Only the dim, red emergency lights remained. In the shadows, the station felt like a different place. The silence was heavy. David realized the storm outside was ending, and soon, the secret partner mentioned in the notebook would arrive. "We need to go to the security room," Sarah said, her manager's instinct returning. "If the fire didn't destroy the backup drives, we might still have proof of who was in the basement tonight." As they turned to leave the smoky lab, they heard a new sound. It wasn't a siren or a fire. It was the sound of a heavy engine outside the station. A vehicle was approaching through the sand. The partner was here. The smoke cleared slowly. The laboratory was now a dark and wet place. The white foam from the fire extinguishers looked like snow on the floor. David felt the cold from the basement still in his bones. He watched Maya as she walked to the central computer console. This machine was the brain of the energy project. "Is the data safe?" Sarah asked. Her voice was shaking. She looked at the blackened metal of the computer. Maya did not answer immediately. She pressed a few buttons on the screen. The glass was cracked, but the light came on. She typed quickly, her eyes moving fast across the lines of code. Suddenly, she stopped. She stared at the screen for a long time. "It is gone," Maya whispered. She looked at the group. "The files are not just burned. They were deleted before the fire started. The main directory is empty." "But the backup system," Dr. Thomas said. He stepped forward, his boots splashing in the wet foam. "We have a backup in the secondary drive." David moved to the back of the large computer cabinet. He was an engineer. He knew where the physical storage was kept. He saw a small metal door on the side of the machine. The door was open. He reached inside. His hand felt nothing but empty space. The physical drive is missing, David said. He showed them the empty slot. Someone opened this door and took the hard drive. The fire was not meant to destroy the project. The fire was a cover so the thief could walk out with the files in their pocket. The room became very quiet. The only sound was the drip of water from the ceiling. David looked at each person. Maya was still sitting at the console. Dr. Thomas was standing near the door. Sarah was next to David, her hand resting on the notebook in her pocket. While we were fighting the fire, the thief was busy. David continued. They knew the alarm would make everyone run to the lab. They knew we would be looking at the flames and not at the back of the computer. This means the thief has everything, Sarah said. They have the research, the energy formulas, and the encryption keys. They can sell this to anyone. Dr. Thomas looked at David and Sarah with narrow eyes. You still haven't told us where you were, he said. The fire started 10 minutes ago. You two appeared from a storage room. You look like you walked through a coal mine. What were you doing? Sarah looked at David. They had the notebook. They knew about the secret basement and the hidden servers. But they did not know if they could trust the doctor or Maya. If one of them was the thief, telling the truth was dangerous. We were checking the ventilation shafts, David said. It was a half-truth. We heard a strange noise in the walls earlier. We thought maybe the vibration was coming from there. When the alarm went off, we were trapped in the ducts for a moment. Dr. Thomas did not look happy with the answer. The vents. In the middle of the night. That is very strange, Mr. Miller. Everything is strange here, David replied. He looked at the empty computer. Our leader is missing, our water is gone, and now our life's work is stolen. We need to find that drive before the thief finds a way to send the data out of the desert. David knew the thief already had a way. He thought about the hidden servers in the cold room. The red lights were probably still blinking, sending their secrets across the world while they stood in the smoke. The air in the laboratory was still thick with the smell of smoke. David looked down at the floor. The white foam from the fire extinguishers was starting to settle. It was like a thick blanket on the ground. As the foam became thinner, David noticed something. Wait, David said. He pointed his flashlight at the floor near the empty computer cabinet. Look there. In the white foam and black dust, there were clear marks. They were footprints. Because the thief had stepped in the wet foam and then walked across the dry parts of the floor, the prints stood out perfectly. They were large, heavy prints from a work boot. Sarah knelt down to look closer. These are fresh, she whispered. The thief stood here to pull out the hard drive. Then they walked that way. She followed the line of footprints with her eyes. The prints led away from the main console and toward the back of the laboratory. They stopped right in front of a small metal door in the wall. It was another ventilation shaft. The metal cover was hanging by one screw. They used the vents too, Dr. Thomas said. He looked at David with a hard expression. Just like you and Sarah. Everyone uses the vents because the main doors are locked or monitored. David replied calmly. But look at the pattern of the boot. Do you see the 3 small circles on the heel? David pointed to the mark in the dust. It was a very specific design. It was a professional safety boot. The kind used by people who work with heavy machinery. I have boots like that, Maya said quietly. She looked at her own feet. Her boots were covered in foam. But the bottom was different. Wait. No. My boots have a star pattern. Let me see your shoes, Doctor. Sarah commanded. Dr. Thomas lifted his foot. His boots were clean and expensive. The bottom was flat. He did not have the 3 circles on the heel. Sarah looked at her own boots. They were small and smooth. Finally, they all looked at David. David lifted his boot. The bottom of his shoe had a zigzag pattern. "It is not me," he said. "Then who is left?" Maya asked. Her voice was trembling. "There are only 4 of us here. If it is not any of us, then who made these prints?" "Dr. Aries," Sarah said. She sounded hopeful. "Maybe he escaped. Maybe he took the drive to keep it safe." David shook his head. He remembered the broken glasses and the notebook. Dr. Aries is a small man. These prints are from a large person. Someone heavy. And there is one more person we are forgetting. "The driver?" Sarah asked. "The driver who brought me here." David said. "We never saw him leave. We thought he drove away before the storm. But the jeep is still here with cut wires. He could be hiding anywhere in this station." David followed the footprints all the way to the vent. He noticed a small piece of red fabric caught on the sharp edge of the metal door. He picked it up. It was a thick, heavy material. "This is not from a lab coat," David said. "This is from a worker's jacket." The mystery was changing. It was no longer just about the scientists. There was a ghost in the walls, a large person with heavy boots who knew the station's secrets. David looked at the dark opening of the ventilation shaft. The thief was close, and they were moving through the shadows of the building. David returned to his room, but he did not close his eyes. He sat in the dark, holding the small piece of red fabric. The station felt like a living thing that was breathing around him. He thought about the heavy boots and the missing hard drive. If the driver was still in the building, where was he hiding? The station was large, but many areas were empty. At 1 o'clock in the morning, David decided to move. He put on his shoes quietly. He did not turn on his flashlight yet. He opened his door and stepped into the hallway. The air was thick and smelled like the old smoke from the laboratory. The walls were gray in the dim light of the emergency lamps. He walked toward the industrial wing. This part of the station held the life support systems. It was a place of heavy pipes and loud machines. As David turned a corner, he stopped. His heart started to beat faster. At the far end of the long corridor, he saw a shadow. It was the shadow of a tall person. The figure was standing perfectly still next to a metal door. David stayed in the darkness. He watched. The person moved, and for a second, a small light hit their back. David saw a flash of dark red. It was the red jacket. The figure started to walk. The person did not run, but they moved very fast. Their steps were heavy, just like the footprints in the lab. David followed. He stayed close to the wall. He moved from shadow to shadow. He did not want the person to look back and see him. The chase went deeper into the station. They passed the laundry room and the water tanks. The air became thinner. Finally, they reached the oxygen room. This was a critical area. It held the giant blue tanks that provided air for every room in the station. If these tanks were damaged, everyone would stop breathing in minutes. The person in the red jacket reached the door of the oxygen room. They used a security badge, and the door opened. The figure stepped inside. David ran forward. He did not care about being quiet anymore. He reached the door just before it closed. He pushed his hand into the gap and forced the door open. Inside, the room was full of giant blue cylinders. They stood like tall soldiers in rows. The room was cold and the air felt very sharp. David looked left and then right. "I know you are here," David shouted. His voice echoed against the metal tanks. "I found the red fabric. I saw the footprints. Show yourself. There was no answer. David walked between the rows of tanks. He looked behind the heavy pipes. He checked the corners. The room had no other windows and no other visible doors. But when he reached the back of the room, he found something strange. One of the large oxygen tanks was moved to the side. Behind it, there was a small maintenance hatch in the floor. The hatch was open. David looked down into the dark hole. He could hear the distant sound of air moving, but he could not see the person. The ghost had escaped again. David stood alone in the cold room. He realized that the person knew the station better than anyone. They were using the hidden paths like a map. He looked at the heavy blue tanks. He felt a new fear. The thief was not just stealing data anymore. They were moving near the very things that kept the scientists alive. The next morning, the sun rose over the desert. But no one felt happy. The orange light came through the small thick windows of the common room. David, Sarah, and Maya sat at the table. They were waiting for Dr. Thomas. Everyone was tired and their eyes were red. They had not slept well because of the ghost in the red jacket. We need to stay together today, Sarah said. She looked at her hands. No one goes anywhere alone. Not even to the bathroom. I agree, Maya said. She was looking at her tablet. I am trying to track the energy signal. If the thief is using a laptop, I might see the digital footprint. The door opened and Dr. Thomas walked in. He looked very old and very tired. His suit was messy. He went straight to the coffee machine in the corner. I need caffeine, he murmured. My head feels like it is full of sand. He poured a large cup of black coffee. The smell of the hot drink filled the room. He took a long drink and sat down across from David. For a moment, everything was quiet. Then, the doctor's face changed. He turned very pale, and his eyes became wide. Doctor, are you okay? David asked. He leaned forward. Dr. Thomas did not answer. He tried to speak, but only a small sound came from his throat. He dropped the coffee cup. The ceramic hit the floor and broke into many pieces. The dark liquid spread across the white tiles. The doctor began to cough loudly. He clutched his throat with both hands. Thomas. Sarah jumped up and ran to him. The doctor's body started to shake. He tried to stand up, but his legs were weak. He fell back into his chair and then slid to the floor. His body hit the ground. He was breathing very fast, and his face was turning a strange shade of blue. David ran to the table. He did not look at the doctor first. He looked at the coffee cup. He picked up a piece of the broken ceramic and smelled it. The coffee did not smell like coffee. It had a sharp, sweet smell, like the cleaning chemicals they used in the main laboratory. He is poisoned, David shouted. Maya, get the medical kit. Sarah, help me turn him on his side. Maya ran to the wall and grabbed a white box. David and Sarah worked together to help the doctor. Dr. Thomas was unconscious now. His breathing was slow and shallow. Is he going to die? Maya whispered. She was holding a needle from the kit, but her hands were shaking too much. Give it to me, David said. He took the medicine and injected it into the doctor's arm. This will help him breathe. But we are not doctors. We need real help. David looked at the coffee machine. The thief is not just hiding anymore. They are attacking us. They put poison in the coffee. They wanted to stop the doctor because he was asking too many questions. Sarah looked around the room with fear. Who was in here this morning? Who touched the machine? I don't know, David said. But the message is clear. The investigation must stop, or we are all in danger. He looked at the doctor on the floor. The station was no longer a place of science. It was a place of murder. They were trapped in the desert with a killer who used chemicals and shadows. David felt a cold weight in his chest. He realized that time was running out. They had to solve the mystery before the coffee, or the air, became their last breath. The orange light outside the windows suddenly disappeared. It was replaced by a wall of deep, dark brown. The wind was no longer just a whistle. It was a heavy force that pushed against the station. The building was strong, but the sand hit the metal walls with a constant, rhythmic force. It sounded like thousands of small stones falling on a tin roof. The storm is at its peak, Sarah said. She had to raise her voice. The pressure is dropping. We need to move Dr. Thomas to the medical wing immediately. David and Maya helped Sarah lift the unconscious doctor. They moved slowly through the hallway. The floor was vibrating under their feet. David could feel the station shaking. As an engineer, he knew this was not good. The foundations of the building were deep in the sand, but a storm of this size could cause structural stress. They reached the medical wing and placed Dr. Thomas on a bed. He was breathing, but he was very still. Maya checked the monitors. His heart is strong, but he is in a deep sleep. The poison was very powerful. Suddenly, the bright white lights in the ceiling flickered. They turned yellow for a second and then went dark. A moment later, they came back on, but they were much dimmer. The main generator, David said. He looked at the ceiling. It is struggling. The sand is probably blocking the air intake for the engines. If the engines cannot breathe, they will stop. We cannot lose power. Maya cried. If the power goes out, the security locks will fail. The computer will shut down. We will be completely blind. I have to go to the generator room, David said. He grabbed his heavy bag of tools. Sarah, stay here with the doctor. Maya, come with me. I need you to watch the control panel while I check the filters. They ran toward the back of the station. The air was getting hot. Without the full cooling system, the desert heat was starting to enter the rooms. They reached the generator room. It was a massive chamber with two giant engines. The noise inside was very loud. The machines were shaking and making a deep, grinding sound. David saw the problem immediately. The pressure gauges were in the red zone. Black smoke was coming from the side of the first engine. The sand is getting into the system, David shouted. The filters are full. He ran to the primary intake valve. He used a heavy wrench to turn the bolts. He worked fast, his hands covered in oil and dust. Maya stood at the computer screen, calling out the numbers. The voltage is dropping. David. 90%, 80%. A bright flash of blue light came from the back of the engine. There was a sharp smell of burning wires. The deep hum of the machinery changed into a slow, dying groan. Then, everything stopped. The silence was sudden and terrifying. The only sound was the wind outside. A second later, the main lights died completely. For a long moment, there was total darkness. Then, a few small lamps on the walls turned on. They were a deep, haunting red. The main power is gone. Maya whispered in the dark. We are on emergency batteries now. They will only last for a few hours. David looked at the red lights. The station looked like a different place. It was no longer a laboratory. It was a dark maze. They were trapped in the middle of a massive storm. The doctor was poisoned, and now they were losing the power they needed to survive. The ghost in the red jacket was still out there, and now they could not see him coming. The red light was everywhere. It was a thick, heavy color that made the white walls of the station look like they were covered in old rust. David stood in the generator room with Maya. They could not see the corners of the room anymore. The large engines were now just giant, dark shapes in the shadows. We cannot stay here. David said. His voice sounded different in the dark. It was low and steady. The batteries are small. We need to save every bit of energy. Maya held her tablet, but the screen was dim to save power. The emergency system is only for the air and the basic sensors. The computers are off. The cameras are off. We are effectively blind now. David. They began to walk back toward the medical wing. Walking in the red light was difficult. It changed how David saw distances. Every shadow looked like a person standing still. Every pipe on the wall looked like a reaching arm. David kept his hand on his heavy wrench. He felt like the ghost was closer than ever. They passed the long corridor of the industrial wing. The air was becoming very still. Without the big fans, the sound of the wind outside was even louder. It was a constant, deep roar that made the floor shake. Look. Maya whispered. She pointed to the floor. In the red light, the white foam from the earlier fire was still there. But now, there were new marks. Someone had walked through the foam recently. The prints were moving away from the medical wing and toward the kitchen. Is that Sarah? Maya asked. Sarah is supposed to be with the doctor. David replied. She promised not to leave him. They moved faster. When they reached the medical wing, they pushed the door open. The room was bathed in the same deep red glow. Sarah was sitting on a chair next to Dr. Thomas. She had a heavy metal flashlight in her lap. She looked up quickly, her eyes wide with fear. Thank God it is you, Sarah said. She stood up. I heard someone in the hallway a few minutes ago. I locked the door, but I heard them breathing on the other side. Did you see who it was? David asked. No. Sarah shook her head. The red light is too dark. I only saw a shadow through the small glass window. It was tall. Very tall. David looked at Dr. Thomas. The doctor was still unconscious. His face looked grey in the red light. We have to move to the common room. David decided. It is the center of the station. It has the thickest walls and only 2 doors. We can watch both of them. But the doctor is heavy. Maya said. We will use the rolling bed. David said. They pushed the doctor's bed into the hallway. The wheels made a long, squeaking sound on the floor. In the red silence, the noise felt very loud. David felt like he was ringing a bell, telling the thief exactly where they were. As they turned the corner into the common room, David looked back. At the end of the red hallway, he saw a door close very slowly. It was the door to the kitchen. Someone was watching them. The ghost was not afraid of the dark. In fact, the red lights seemed to make the thief more active. David pushed the doctor into the room and closed the door. He turned the manual lock. For now, they were safe. But the red lights were a reminder that time was running out. David sat on a metal chair. He looked at the floor. He could still see the image of the footprints in his mind. The 3 small circles on the heel were very important. The red emergency light made everything look strange. But he remembered the pattern perfectly. We need to talk, David said. His voice was loud in the quiet room. Sarah looked up. She was holding a wet cloth on the forehead of Dr. Thomas. About what? She asked. She looked very tired. The footprints. David replied. In the laboratory, I saw a specific pattern. 3 circles on the heel. It is a very rare design for a boot. I want to check everyone's shoes again, very carefully. Maya looked at her feet. We already looked in the lab. David. It was not us. We are all wearing our work shoes. The light was bad in the lab. David said. And there was smoke. I want to see them here, under this light. Please, take off your boots and put them on the table. Sarah frowned. David, this is not the time. The doctor is sick. The power is out. We should be thinking about the generator. This is exactly the time. David said firmly. Someone poisoned the coffee. Someone took the hard drive. If we do not find the thief, we might not see the morning. We cannot trust each other until we check. Sarah sighed. She stood up and pulled off her heavy leather boots. She placed them on the table. David picked them up. He turned them over and moved them close to a red lamp. The bottom was smooth with some small lines. There were no circles. Now you. Maya. David said. Maya looked nervous. She slowly removed her boots. She was wearing thick grey socks. She put her boots next to Sarah's. David checked them. The bottom of Maya's boots had a clear star pattern. There were no circles. David took off his own boots. He showed them the zigzag pattern on the bottom. It is not me either. He said. So, there is a fifth person. Maya whispered. She looked at the dark corners of the room. The driver. Is he hiding in the station? David did not answer. He stood up and walked to the storage locker in the corner of the common room. This was where they kept extra coats and blankets for guests. The metal door was not closed properly. It was open just a few centimeters. He pulled the door open. Inside, there were several heavy jackets. At the bottom of the locker, hidden under a brown blanket, David saw a pair of boots. They were covered in fresh orange dust. He picked one up and turned it over. His heart started to beat very fast. On the heel, there were 3 small circles. Whose locker is this? David asked. He held the boot up so the women could see it. Sarah walked over. She looked at the locker and then at David. This is not a private locker. David. It is the guest locker. It is the one assigned to you. David froze. But I did not put these here. My boots are on the table. I only brought 1 pair to the desert. Maya stepped back, moving closer to the door. She looked at David with fear in her eyes. Maybe you have 2 pairs. David. Maybe you are the one playing a game with us. You are an engineer. You know how to fix things, and you know how to break them. David looked at the boot in his hand. Someone had put these here to make him look guilty. The thief was very smart. They were always 1 step ahead. David held the heavy boot in his hand. He felt the eyes of Sarah and Maya on him. In the red light, their faces looked like masks of stone. They did not trust him. He could see it in the way Maya moved closer to the exit and how Sarah held her flashlight like a weapon. I am being framed. David said. His voice was calm, but his heart was racing. Think about it. If I were the thief, why would I leave the evidence in my own locker? And why would I show you the 3 circles on the heel earlier? Maybe you thought we would never look in your locker. Maya said. Her voice was shaking. You are very clever. David. You are an engineer. You know how to hide things in plain sight. I was with Sarah in the basement. David reminded them. And I was with you, Maya, in the generator room. I have not been alone long enough to do all these things. Sarah looked at the boot and then at David. She seemed confused. He is right about the basement. Maya. He was with me when we found the notebook. But who else could have these boots? Before Maya could answer, a small, high-pitched whistle began to come from the wall. It was a thin sound, like a tiny bird. On the wall, a small screen flashed with a yellow light. The numbers on the screen were falling fast. The oxygen. Sarah cried. She ran to the screen. The air pressure is dropping. The system is failing. The oxygen room. David said. He dropped the boot and grabbed his bag of tools. The shadow I followed went there last night. We have to go now. They ran out of the common room. They left Dr. Thomas on his bed. They had no choice. Without air, no one would survive. They moved through the red hallways, their breath coming in short, quick gasps. The air already felt thin and dry. When they reached the heavy metal door of the oxygen room, David grabbed the handle. He pulled, but it did not move. He tried his security badge, but the red light on the scanner did not turn green. It is locked from the inside, David said. He looked at the electronic panel. The wires were pulled out. Someone destroyed the lock. They don't want us to get in. Can you open it? Maya asked. She was leaning against the wall. She was starting to feel dizzy. I have to, David said. He knelt in front of the door. He opened his tool bag and took out a long, thin piece of metal and a heavy screwdriver. He began to work on the manual part of the lock. He had to be very careful. If he broke the internal gears, the door would stay shut forever. He worked in the dim red light. Sweat ran down his face. He could hear Sarah and Maya coughing behind him. The oxygen was disappearing. His own head began to ache. He pushed the metal tool into the lock and turned it slowly. He heard a small, sharp snap inside the door. He felt the gears move. He stood up and put his shoulder against the heavy iron. Help me, he shouted. Sarah and Maya stepped forward. They all pushed together. With a loud, grinding sound of metal against metal, the door finally moved. It swung open into the dark room. A cloud of cold, white mist flowed out of the room, but there was a strange smell. It did not smell like fresh air. It smelled like oil and old smoke. David pointed his flashlight into the room. The giant blue tanks were still there, but something was very wrong. The oxygen room was freezing. The white mist was thick, and it was hard to see the floor. David kept his flashlight moving. He heard a sharp, whistling sound coming from the left side of the room. It was the sound of air escaping under high pressure. He followed the noise to the third giant blue tank. There is a hole in the main pipe, David shouted. He had to breathe quickly because the air in the room was very thin. He saw a silver pipe that connected the tank to the wall. There was a long, thin crack in the metal. It looked like someone had hit it with a heavy hammer. David reached into his bag and pulled out a roll of thick, black industrial tape and a metal clamp. He worked fast. His hands were shaking from the cold, but he managed to wrap the tape around the crack. He then tightened the clamp over the tape. The whistling sound became quieter and then finally stopped. David looked at the pressure gauge on the wall. The needle stopped falling. It began to rise very slowly. The air is coming back, Maya said. She was sitting on the floor, trying to catch her breath. You saved us, David. We are not safe yet, David replied. He wiped the cold water from his forehead. Someone did this on purpose. They wanted us to run out of air. While David and Maya looked at the pipe, Sarah walked to the back of the room. This room was near the outer edge of the station. There was a small, thick glass window that looked into a narrow maintenance passage. The window was covered in a very thick layer of grey dust because no one ever cleaned it. Sarah turned on her flashlight. The beam hit the dusty glass. She stopped moving. Her face became very still. David. Maya, come here, she said. Her voice was a low whisper. David and Sarah walked to the window. In the thick dust on the glass, there were words. They were written with a finger. The person had pushed the dust away to make the letters. The message was simple and clear. Do not trust the doctor. David stared at the words. The letters were large and shaky. It looked like someone wrote them in a hurry. The doctor? Maya asked. She looked back toward the door. But Dr. Thomas is unconscious. He was poisoned. Why would he be the one we shouldn't trust? Maybe he was not poisoned, Sarah suggested. Her eyes were wide. Maybe he took a small amount of the chemical to make himself look like a victim. It is a very old trick. David thought about the coffee. He remembered how the doctor dropped the cup and fell. But he looked very sick. David said. His face was blue. That is hard to fake. He is a doctor. Sarah reminded him. He knows exactly how much to take to look sick without dying. And remember, he was the only one who had a blue pen. I saw blue ink on the broken radio. David looked at the message again. If the message was true, then they had left a killer alone in the common room. Even if he was unconscious now, he could wake up at any moment. Or maybe he was already awake and waiting for them. Who wrote this? David asked. It must be Dr. Aries. Sarah said. He was the only other person who knew about this room and the hidden paths. He was trying to warn us before he was taken. David felt a cold shiver. They were standing in a dark room, surrounded by mystery. He looked at the door. We need to go back to the common room. He said. We need to check on Dr. Thomas. If he is awake, we need to find out the truth. The walk back to the common room was a journey of shadows and silence. The red emergency lights made every corridor look like the inside of a dying star. David led the way, his wrench held tightly in his hand. Behind him, Sarah and Maya walked close together, their eyes darting to every dark corner and ventilation grate. When they reached the common room, David stopped. The heavy door was not just unlocked, it was standing wide open. The red light from the hallway spilled into the room, illuminating the wet tiles where the coffee had spilled. He's gone, David whispered. They stepped inside. The rolling medical bed where they had left Dr. Thomas was empty. The blankets were tossed onto the floor, and the heart monitor was silent, its wires dangling like broken vines. The medical kit David had used was knocked over, and small white pills were scattered across the floor like tiny teeth. How is that possible? Maya asked, her voice trembling. He was unconscious. He was barely breathing. David walked over to the bed. He knelt down and picked up the syringe he had used to give the doctor the medicine. The needle was bent, and the plastic tube was snapped in half. Near the leg of the bed, he spotted a small, clear glass vial. It was empty, but it hadn't been there before. He picked it up and held it to the red light. This isn't the poison, David said. It's a powerful stimulant. It's the kind of drug used to wake someone up from a deep shock. So he wasn't faking the poisoning? Sarah asked, looking confused. He might have been truly sick. David replied. But someone came in here and woke him up. Or, he had this hidden on him and injected himself the moment we left the room. Sarah suddenly reached for her belt. She let out a short, sharp gasp. My master badge, it's gone. He must have taken it while I was distracted by the oxygen alarm. This was the worst possible news. The master badge could open any door in Station Zero. The laboratory, the server room, even the main exit gate. With that badge, Dr. Thomas was no longer a prisoner of the storm. He was the master of the station. We have to find him, Sarah said, her voice turning cold with anger. If he has the master badge and the hard drive, he's going to wait for the storm to break and then disappear into the desert. David looked at the empty bed. He noticed a smudge of blue on the white pillowcase. He touched it with his finger. It was wet ink. A blue pen. The message in the oxygen room said, "Do not trust the doctor." David reminded them. But if the doctor is the thief, who wrote the message? Dr. Aries is still missing. If Thomas took him, where would he put him? A loud, metallic thud echoed from above their heads. It came from the ceiling, the direction of the roof access. The communication tower. Maya said, her eyes widening. There's a secondary radio at the top of the tower. It's hardwired. If he can get up there, he can signal his partners outside, even if the main radio is broken. David didn't wait. He grabbed his flashlight and ran for the door. The mystery was no longer a puzzle to be solved. It was a race to the top of the station. David ran down the narrow hallway that led to the central maintenance shaft. Sarah and Maya were right behind him, their footsteps echoing like rapid drumbeats. The air was getting thicker again, and the smell of the storm, the scent of hot, dry ozone and ancient dust, was leaking through the station seams. They reached a small, circular room at the base of the communication tower. In the center was a vertical iron ladder that disappeared into a dark hole in the ceiling. Next to the ladder, a heavy metal hatch was swinging back and forth, hitting the wall with a rhythmic rhythm. The lock has been melted, David noted, pointing his flashlight at the edge of the hatch. The metal was bubbled and blackened. He used a portable thermal cutter. This wasn't a quick job. He's been planning this for a long time. I'll go first, Sarah said, reaching for the rungs. I know the layout of the upper deck. No. David stopped her. If he has a cutter or a weapon, you'll be a target. I'm faster. Stay 5 rungs below me. David grabbed the cold iron and began to climb. The ladder was long, nearly 20 meters of vertical ascent. As they climbed higher, the sound of the wind changed from a roar to a scream. The entire tower was vibrating, swaying slightly in the powerful gusts of the desert storm. When they reached the top, David pushed against the final exit hatch. It didn't budge. He put his shoulder into it and shoved with all his strength. The hatch flew open, and a blast of sand and wind hit him like a physical blow. He pulled himself up onto the observation deck. The world was a chaotic vortex of brown and orange. He could barely see his own hands. He crawled across the metal grating, squinting against the stinging sand. Over there! Maya shouted, her voice nearly lost in the wind. She was pointing toward the base of the massive satellite dish. A figure was huddled against the main control box of the antenna. The red emergency light from the tower's beacon illuminated a dark red jacket. It wasn't the doctor's lab coat. It was the ghost, the tall, thin figure David had seen on his first night. The figure turned around. In the dim light, David saw a familiar face, but it wasn't Dr. Thomas. It was the driver, the man who had brought David to the station. He was holding a small, glowing device, the stolen hard drive, and he was plugging it into the tower's emergency transmitter. Stop! David yelled, trying to stand up, but a gust of wind nearly knocked him off the deck. The driver didn't stop. He looked at David with a cold, empty expression. But then, a second shadow emerged from behind the satellite dish. It was Dr. Thomas. He looked weak, and he was leaning against the metal, but he had a heavy wrench in his hand. He's not sending a signal. Dr. Thomas croaked, his voice barely audible over the storm. He's deleting the final sequence. He's trying to trigger an overload. The driver ignored the doctor and focused on the screen. You scientists were always too slow. The driver shouted over the wind. The project was never meant to save the world. It was meant to be sold. And if I can't have it, nobody will. Suddenly, the tower groaned. A massive gust of wind hit the dish, and the metal began to twist. David realized that the storm wasn't just a background threat. It was about to tear the top of Station Zero apart. The wind was a physical wall, screaming through the lattice of the tower. David crawled forward, his fingers digging into the metal grating. The tower swayed violently, a sickening lurch that felt like a ship on a stormy sea. Under the red strobe of the emergency beacon, the scene looked like a nightmare. The hard drive. David yelled, pointing at the glowing device. Maya, can you override the transmitter from here? Maya huddled near the hatch, her tablet screen flickering wildly. No. His locked the local port. I need to physically disconnect the uplink or the whole station's power core will surge. The driver, the man who had posed as David's silent escort, sneered. He wasn't a simple driver. He was a specialist. He held a heavy industrial flare gun in one hand, the orange barrel aimed at David's chest. Stay back, engineer. The driver shouted. The sequence is already at 90%. In 2 minutes, the energy project becomes a bomb. The fire will clean everything. No evidence. No witnesses. The revelation. Dr. Thomas, leaning heavily against the satellite base, coughed up a bit of dust. I tried to stop him in the lab. The doctor panted. The message, the one you saw. He wrote it. He wanted you to turn on me. David looked from the doctor to the driver. The pieces clicked. The boots. The driver must have swapped his boots into David's locker to create a rift. The poison. The driver poisoned the coffee to take out the most suspicious person. Dr. Thomas. The message. A clever piece of psychological warfare to keep the group divided. Where is Dr. Aries? Sarah screamed, her voice cracking. The driver laughed, a hollow sound lost in the wind. Ask the desert. He wouldn't give me the final codes, so he took a long walk without a compass. The collapse. A massive groan of twisting metal echoed through the deck. One of the primary support cables for the satellite dish snapped. The massive silver dish tilted, its weight shifting the balance of the entire tower. The tower is going down. David realized. He didn't think. He acted. He lunged across the grating, not for the driver, but for the emergency manual override lever located at the base of the antenna. If he could dump the tower's electrical load into the lightning rods, he could save the station, even if the tower fell. The driver fired the flare gun. A streak of brilliant red light hissed past David's head, illuminating the swirling sand. David reached the lever. It was frozen with grit and rust. He slammed his wrench against the handle. Maya! Now! David roared. Maya lunged forward, grabbing the hard drive. The driver reached for her, but Dr. Thomas, using the last of his strength, tackled the man's legs. Both men hit the grating hard. David threw his entire weight onto the lever. With a scream of metal, it moved. A blinding arc of blue electricity shot up the antenna, leaping into the storm. The transmitter exploded in a shower of sparks. The glowing light on the hard drive died. The overload was stopped. But the tower was finished. The main support groaned one last time and began to buckle. The hatch. Get to the hatch. David screamed, grabbing Sarah and Maya by their coats and shoving them toward the hole in the floor. He looked back. The driver was scrambling up, his eyes wide with fury. Dr. Thomas lay still. The tower tilted further, the desert floor waiting below in the dark. The world was tilting at a terrifying 45-degree angle. The metal grating of the observation deck groaned, the sound of steel being torn apart by a giant's hand. David gripped a support rail with one hand and Sarah's coat with the other, hauling her toward the square opening of the hatch. Go! Move! David screamed over the howl of the sand. Maya scrambled down the ladder first, her boots disappearing into the dark hole. Sarah followed, her eyes wide with terror as she looked past the edge of the deck into the swirling abyss of the desert below. David turned back. The red strobe light flickered, illuminating the chaos. Dr. Thomas was trying to crawl toward them, but the angle of the deck was too steep. Behind him, the driver, his red jacket now shredded by the wind, was on his feet. He wasn't reaching for a weapon anymore. He was reaching for the hard drive that had fallen near the edge. The final stand. "Leave it!" David shouted. "The tower is going down." The driver ignored him. Greed had replaced his professionalism. He lunged for the glowing drive just as another support cable snapped. The deck lurched violently. The driver lost his footing, sliding across the metal toward the edge. He grabbed the railing at the last second, his legs dangling over the empty desert. The hard drive spun across the grating and vanished into the storm. "Thomas. Your hand." David braced his feet against the hatch frame and reached out. The doctor's fingers brushed David's. For a moment, their eyes met, a look of shared exhaustion and a flicker of hope. David grabbed the doctor's wrist and began to pull him toward the hatch. "Help him!" Thomas gasped, pointing toward the driver. David looked at the man hanging over the edge. The driver's face was twisted in a mask of pure terror. For a split second, David felt the weight of the decision. But then, the main mast of the tower gave a final, deafening crack. The brake. No time. David yelled. He shoved Dr. Thomas into the hatch, where Maya and Sarah caught him from below. David looked at the driver. "Jump for the ladder!" He screamed, reaching out a hand. The driver tried to pull himself up, but the metal railing he was holding onto simply sheared away from the buckling deck. With a short, sharp cry that was instantly swallowed by the wind, the man vanished into the brown wall of the sandstorm. David didn't wait to see more. He swung himself into the hatch and slid down the ladder, the heat of friction burning his palms. He fell the last 3 meters, landing on top of the others in the small circular room at the base. The entire station shook. A massive, ground-trembling thud vibrated through the floor as the communication tower collapsed into the desert. The sound of tearing metal was followed by a sudden, eerie silence, broken only by the muffled roar of the wind against the station's main hull. Status check. They lay in a heap in the red-lit maintenance room. Dust fell from the ceiling like snow. Sarah, scraped and bruised, but breathing. Maya, clutched her tablet, her hands shaking. Dr. Thomas, unconscious again, the strain of the climb too much for his weakened heart. The hard drive, lost to the sands. The driver, gone. David sat up, wiping blood from a cut on his forehead. "Is everyone okay?" "We're alive," Sarah whispered, clutching her side. "But the tower is gone. We're truly cut off now. And the drive is gone too," Maya added, her voice hollow. "All that work, all that danger, for nothing." David looked at the locked door leading back into the main station. He felt the weight of the black notebook in his pocket, the one he'd taken from the secret basement. "Not for nothing," he said. "We still have the truth. And we still have to find Dr. Aries." The storm was still screaming outside, but inside Station Zero, the air felt different. The ghost was gone, but the mystery of the lead scientist remained. The common room felt like a tomb. Without the constant hum of the main generators, the silence of the station was heavy, broken only by the muffled, rhythmic thumping of the sandstorm against the outer hull. They had moved Dr. Thomas back to the sofa, wrapping him in heavy blankets. His breathing was shallow, but his color was returning. Sarah sat by the window, staring into the dark orange swirl of the storm. "The driver," he said. Aries took a long walk without a compass. "In this weather, that's a death sentence." He was lying, David said firmly. He pulled the black notebook from his pocket. The leather was scuffed, and the pages felt brittle. "The driver wanted us to stop looking. He wanted us to believe Aries was already gone so we would focus only on the hard drive." David flipped to the very back of the notebook. He noticed something he hadn't seen in the dim light of the server room. The last few pages weren't written on. They were glued together. Using his pocket knife, He carefully sliced the edges. Inside the hidden flap was a small, hand-drawn diagram of the station's foundation. "Look at this," David whispered, beckoning Sarah and Maya over. "Here is the kitchen. Here is the secret basement with the servers. But look at the cooling system pipes. They don't just go to the fans." He pointed to a small, unlabeled square at the very edge of the map, located beneath the external water tanks. It was labeled only with a single Greek letter. Omega. The Omega point. Sarah breathed. Aries used to talk about it in his early lectures. He called it the point of total stability. "I thought it was just philosophy." "It's not philosophy," David said, his eyes scanning the diagram. "It's a bunker. A reinforced maintenance crawlspace designed to survive a total station collapse. It has its own oxygen supply and a manual lock. But the only way to get there is through the cooling tunnels." Maya noted, her face pale. "The fans are still spinning, David. Even on emergency power, they'll pull enough air to turn a person into confetti. Then we turn them off," David said. "Manually." The descent into the tunnels. They left Maya to watch over the doctor and headed back toward the western hall. The air was colder here, smelling of grease and cold metal. When they reached the heavy door marked cooling system, David didn't use his badge. He used the master key Sarah had recovered from the common room floor, dropped by the driver during the struggle. The door groaned open. Beyond lay a forest of massive silver pipes and the deafening, low-frequency throb of the giant fans. The red emergency lights reflected off the spinning blades, creating a strobe effect that made David's head spin. The manual shutoff is behind the primary turbine. Sarah shouted over the noise. David crawled under a series of vibrating pipes, the heat from the machinery radiating against his back. He found the large red lever. It was locked with a heavy padlock. He didn't have time to find a key. He raised his heavy wrench and smashed the lock with 3 powerful blows. He threw his weight onto the lever. The vibration in the floor began to slow. The roar of the fans turned into a long, dying whistle. "They're stopping," Sarah called out. As the blades came to a halt, David saw it. Behind the third fan housing, there was a small, circular hatch. It was painted a dull gray, nearly invisible against the machinery. It wasn't locked from the outside. It was bolted from the inside. David knocked on the metal. Silence. He knocked again. Harder. "Dr. Aries." "It's David Miller. I'm with Sarah. The traitor is gone. It's safe." For a long minute, there was no sound but the whistling wind outside. Then, the heavy bolts began to slide back with a slow, grinding protest of rusted metal. The hatch creaked open just a few centimeters. A pair of cracked spectacles peered through the darkness. "David?" A frail, trembling voice asked. Is the data safe?" David looked at Sarah, then back at the man in the hole. "We're alive, Doctor. That's what matters right now." David reached into the narrow opening and helped pull the elderly scientist out. Dr. Aries was a shadow of his former self. His lab coat was torn, and his face was gaunt from 3 days in the dark. He clutched a small, silver canister to his chest as if it were more precious than his own life. "Careful, David," Aries rasped, his voice barely a whisper. "The floor, it's slippery." Sarah rushed forward, tears in her eyes. "Doctor, we thought the driver had killed you." "He tried," Aries said, leaning heavily on David's shoulder as they moved away from the silent fans. "He wanted the final decryption keys for the core. When I refused, he tried to force me into the desert. I managed to trip the silent alarm in the cooling room and slip into the maintenance ducts. I've been waiting, listening to his boots above me for days." They made their way back to the common room, moving through the red-lit halls like ghosts. When they arrived, Maya let out a cry of relief, and even Dr. Thomas, who was now awake but very weak, managed a small nod of greeting. The station's status report. As they settled in, David took a moment to assess their grim reality. He laid it out for the group. The final secret. Dr. Aries sat on a crate, sipping a small amount of water. He placed the silver canister on the table. You all think the driver stole the project. You think the hard drive he took was the prize. Wasn't it? Maya asked, confused. It had all the formulas. It had the equations. Aries corrected. But equations are just ink without the catalyst. The hard drive is useless without this. He tapped the canister. This is the stabilized isotope. The project isn't just about energy, David. It's about atmospheric ionization. David's eyes widened. As an engineer, he understood the math. You're not just making power. You're trying to change the very air, to neutralize the dust storms. Exactly. Aries nodded. If this technology works, we can stop the desert from growing. We can turn the wasteland back into a garden. That is why they wanted it. Not to save the world, but to control the weather. To use the storms as a weapon. Suddenly, the station groaned again. A deep, grinding sound echoed from the floor beneath them. The orange glow outside the window was changing. The deep brown of the sand was fading into a pale, ghostly gray. The storm is breaking, Sarah said, standing up. But the station. David, the vibrations are getting worse. The tower collapse didn't just break the radio. David realized, looking at the ceiling. It shifted the weight of the entire building. The foundation is sliding into the sand dune. They weren't out of the woods yet. The storm was ending. But Station Zero was about to be swallowed by the very desert it was built to study. The station groaned again, a deep, stomach-turning tilt to the west. On the table, the silver canister containing the isotope began to slide slowly toward the edge. David caught it just in time, his boots slipping on the smooth floor. "We're losing the foundation," David said, his voice tight. The collapse of the tower didn't just break our comms. It acted like a giant lever, prying the western wing right out of the bedrock. If we hit a 30-degree tilt, the internal seals will snap. We'll be crushed by the sand before we can even say goodbye. Sarah grabbed the edge of the desk. "Can we stabilize it?" "You're the engineer. David, tell me there's a level station button somewhere." "There is," David replied, pulling up a structural schematic on Maya's tablet. Station Zero has 4 massive hydraulic struts designed to keep it level during shifting dunes. But there's a catch, actually, 2. The stabilization plan. David quickly sketched out the requirements on a piece of scrap paper. To save the station, they had to perform a high-stakes power reroute. If we move the power to the struts. Maya whispered, her eyes wide. The oxygen scrubbers stop. The lights go out. Everything goes out. It's better than being buried alive in a metal coffin. David countered gently. He looked at Dr. Aries. "Doctor, I need that isotope. If we can't get enough voltage from the batteries, I might be able to use the ionization chamber to create a temporary plasma arc. It's a trick I read about in a paper. Yours, actually." Aries looked at the canister, then at David. He gave a weary, respectful nod. "The theory is sound, David. The execution, however, is explosive. Use it only as a last resort." The dead zone. David and Maya ran toward the primary power junction in the center of the station. The floor was now at a permanent slant, making every step a climb. The red emergency lights flickered, 10% power remaining. On my mark. Maya. David said, standing before the massive breaker panel. He held the isotope canister near the auxiliary intake. Cut the life support. All of it. Maya's hand hovered over the master switch. David, if this doesn't work, we won't have enough power to turn the air back on. I know. David said, offering a small, dry smile. I never liked breathing that much anyway. Too much dust. Do it. Maya slammed the switch. The station plunged into absolute, crushing darkness. The hum of the air system died, leaving a silence so heavy it felt like a physical weight. David worked by the light of a single headlamp, his fingers moving with frantic precision. He felt the cold air instantly begin to settle. He cracked the seal on the canister. A brilliant, violet glow illuminated his face. The isotope hummed, a sound he felt in his teeth. He jammed the connector into the manual override. Clear. He shouted. He slammed the hydraulic lever. For a heartbeat. Nothing happened. Then, the very earth began to shake. Deep beneath them, 4 massive steel legs, the feet of the station, began to grind against the sand and rock. The sound was like a mountain screaming. Slowly, agonizingly, the floor began to level. The darkness in the power hub was absolute, save for the pulsating, ethereal violet light emanating from the open isotope canister. It cast long, dancing shadows of David and Maya against the cold metal of the breaker panel. The air was deathly still. The silence was the sound of the station no longer breathing. David. Maya whispered, her breath visible in the violet light. The isotope. It's not stabilizing. The plasma arc is climbing. David looked at the small monitor he had hooked up to the bypass. The numbers were erratic. The ionization process was creating a feedback loop. If he didn't disconnect the canister now, the surge would fry every circuit in Station Zero, leaving them in a high-tech tomb. I need to decouple the lead. David said, his voice strained. But the magnets are fused. I need more leverage. The kinetic solution. David didn't have time for precision. He grabbed his heavy wrench and positioned it between the glowing canister and the junction port. Note. The ionization of the atmosphere within the canister was creating a localized electromagnetic field. Touching it with metal was risky, but it was their only way to break the circuit. Maya, when I hit this, the spark is going to be massive. You have to slam the life support breaker the instant you see white light. Not violet, white. That's the residual energy from the arc. And if I miss it? Maya asked. Then we'll be the best-lit statues in the Sahara. David quipped, though his hands were shaking. The spark of life. David braced his feet against the now level floor. He counted down. 3, 2, 1. He slammed the wrench down with all his might. A bolt of white-blue plasma jumped from the canister to the junction. The light was blinding, a miniature sun born in the center of the station. Now! David roared. Maya slammed the breaker. For a second, the station felt like it was going to explode. The floor vibrated, and a high-pitched whine filled the air. Then, with a series of heavy mechanical clunks, the overhead lights flickered. They weren't the dim red of the emergency batteries, nor the violet of the isotope. They were a steady, pale white. A low, rhythmic thrum started beneath their feet. The scrubbers. Maya gasped, leaning against the wall as she inhaled a deep lungful of recycling air. The oxygen is back. Current station diagnostics. The power surge had been enough to jumpstart the secondary backup systems that had been jammed by the sand. David looked down at his wrench. The head of the tool was scorched black, and the isotope canister was now a dull, inert gray. The catalyst was spent, but they were no longer sinking, and they could finally breathe. We did it. Maya said, a small, exhausted smile breaking through the grime on her face. "We're level, and we're breathing." David agreed. He looked at the door. "Now let's see if Dr. Aries and the others survived the reboot." As they stepped out into the hallway, a new sound caught David's attention. It wasn't the wind, and it wasn't the station. It was a rhythmic, electronic chirping coming from the security hub. The sensors were picking something up. David and Maya practically tumbled into the security hub. The red emergency lighting had been replaced by a pale, flickering white, giving the room the sterile feel of an old hospital. On the main console, a single amber light was flashing in sync with a sharp, insistent chirp. "Is it a distress signal?" Sarah asked, appearing in the doorway with Dr. Aries leaning on her shoulder. Maya's fingers flew across the keyboard, bypassing the fried circuits. "No. It's a proximity scan. The long-range sensors are back online because the sand in the air is finally settling. Look." She tapped a key, and a topographical map of the surrounding dunes appeared on the main screen. The storm was indeed breaking. The chaotic static of the wind was gone, replaced by the clean, undulating lines of the desert. But there, on the eastern edge of the display, 4 bright green pulses were moving steadily toward the center. "Those aren't rescue vehicles," Dr. Aries said, his voice trembling as he leaned closer to the screen. "Rescue teams from the agency move in a wide V formation to cover more ground. These are moving in a tactical diamond. They're coming for the isotope." "But the isotope is spent," David said, gesturing back toward the power hub. "It's a hunk of lead now." "They don't know that," Sarah noted. Her face hardened. "And they won't care. To them, we're just the witnesses left behind." The visual confirmation. David walked to the heavy, reinforced observation window at the front of the hub. He wiped away a layer of fine dust on the inside. Outside, the world was a haunting, beautiful gray. The sun was trying to pierce through the remaining haze, casting long, dramatic shadows over the dunes. In the distance, 4 plumes of sand were rising into the sky. He could see the silhouettes now, heavy, 6-wheeled sand crawlers, built for speed and armor. They weren't flying any flags. "They'll be here in less than 10 minutes. David calculated. "We have no tower, no radio, and the front airlock is jammed with 5 tons of sand." Maya said, her voice rising in panic. "We're sitting ducks." David looked at the map, then at the spent isotope canister he had brought with him. He then looked at the structural schematics of the station's cooling vents, the ones that led out to the now-collapsed communication tower. "They think they're coming to a dead station to pick up a prize," David said, a spark of his old engineering grit returning to his eyes. "But this station still has one secret left. Maya, can you still access the external floodlights?" "Maybe," she replied. "Why?" "Because if we can't call for help," David said, "we're going to have to make so much noise that the entire satellite network sees us." The vibrations from the approaching sand crawlers were now a steady, rhythmic thrumming in the floor. David checked the sensor screen one last time. The tactical diamond was closing in. The lead vehicle was less than 2 kilometers away. "The front airlock is useless," David muttered, his eyes scanning the station's electrical grid on Maya's tablet. "They'll probably try the maintenance hatch or just blow the external seals. We have 5 minutes before they're on our doorstep." "What's the plan, David?" Dr. Aries asked, clutching the spent silver canister. "How do we signal the satellites without an antenna?" David pointed to the cooling vents that led to the stump of the collapsed communication tower. "We still have the ionization residue in the cooling tunnels. When we pulsed the isotope, it didn't just level the station, it charged the air with a high density of ions. If we vent that gas through the tower's base and hit it with the external floodlights at a specific frequency, we can create a lidar effect." "The optical math," David scribbled a formula onto the glass of the console with a dry erase marker. To be picked up by the GEOS-8 search and rescue satellites, the pulse needed to be distinct from any natural desert phenomenon. We need to pulse the lights at exactly $4.5 HZ $. David explained. It's the universal distress frequency for automated satellite detection. It will look like a literal beacon of light shooting straight out of the desert. The final reroute. Maya, I need you to cycle the floodlight breakers manually. David commanded. I'll head to the cooling room to open the emergency vent. Sarah, stay with the doctors. If they get inside before the signal works, hide in the Omega bunker. David sprinted back toward the cooling room. The air was still cold, but the silence was gone. He could hear the grinding of heavy tires on the sand outside. He reached the manual vent wheel, a rusted iron circle that looked like it belonged on a submarine. He threw his weight into it. The wheel groaned. Inch by inch, the internal shutters opened. A faint, violet-tinted mist, the ionized gas, began to hiss out through the tunnel, rising toward the hole where the tower used to be. Maya, pulse them now. David screamed into his radio. In the security hub, Maya began a rhythmic dance with the switches. On, off, on, off. Outside, the 4 floodlights at the base of the tower stump roared to life. The beams hit the rising cloud of gas. Instead of scattering, the light caught the charged particles, glowing with an intense, blinding white brilliance that shot 500 meters into the clearing sky. It was a pillar of fire in the middle of a gray wasteland. The arrival. The external maintenance hatch had been breached. David heard the heavy thud of boots, many boots, hitting the floor in the industrial wing. These weren't the hesitant steps of the driver. These were the synchronized movements of a tactical team. We're in position. A voice boomed through the hallways, amplified by a megaphone. Surrender the isotope and the research data, and no one else has to die. David stood in the dark cooling room, his hand still on the vent wheel. The signal was out, but the wolves were already inside the den. David stayed low in the cooling room, his heart hammering against his ribs. The tactical team was moving with professional efficiency. He could hear the rhythmic steps of their boots and the short, burst-like commands over their radios. They were already through the industrial wing and heading for the security hub. They're split. David whispered to himself, watching the shadows dance under the door. 2 for the hub, 2 for the server room. He looked at the spent isotope canister in his hand. It was worthless now, but in the dim, flickering light of the station, it still looked like a high-tech treasure. It was his only leverage. He reached for the primary steam bypass valve, a massive iron wheel that regulated the heat exchange for the entire station. The tactical loadout. David peered through a small gap in the door. He counted 4 operatives. They weren't soldiers. They were private contractors, equipped with top-tier gear. The diversion. If they have thermal optics, I can't hide. David realized. But I can overload their sensors. He grabbed a heavy metal pipe and jammed it into the manual override of the steam vent. With a violent heave, he wrenched the valve open. A deafening roar filled the room as superheated steam hissed into the hallway. Within seconds, the corridor was a wall of white, opaque vapor. To a thermal camera, this wasn't just a cloud, it was a whiteout. The heat from the steam would blind their sensors, turning their high-tech goggles into useless pieces of plastic. Target obscured. Switching to manual. A voice shouted from the mist. David didn't wait. He slipped into the steam, using his knowledge of the station's layout to move toward the security hub. He knew every pipe and every junction by touch. He passed within inches of an operative, the man's flashlight beam cutting uselessly through the thick vapor. The confrontation. David reached the security hub door just as the commander, a tall, scarred man in a gray tactical vest, was preparing to place a breaching charge. "Stop!" David yelled, stepping out of the steam. He held the silver canister high. "You blow that door, and I drop this. The isotope is unstable. If the casing cracks, the ionization surge will vaporize this entire wing. Nobody gets the research." The commander froze, his hand hovering over the detonator. He turned his head slowly, his cold blue eyes locking onto David. Through the swirling steam, the violet residue still clinging to the canister made it look alive and dangerous. "You're bluffing, engineer," the commander said, his voice a low growl. "You wouldn't kill your friends." "I don't have to," David replied, his voice steady. "I just have to kill you. My friends are in the Omega bunker. They'll survive the blast. You won't." For a long, agonizing second, the only sound was the hiss of the steam and the distant, fading roar of the desert wind. Then, the commander's radio chirped. "Commander, come in. We have a visual, multiple air signatures approaching from the north. Heavy lift halos. Identification. Agency rescue wing. They're moving fast." The ALIO's flare had worked. The commander's eyes flickered between David and the door to the security hub. The radio in his ear was a constant stream of frantic updates. The agency helicopters were no longer just a blip. They were coming in hot. "Drop the canister, Miller," the commander said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "The agency won't get here in time to stop me from taking your head. If I leave now, I leave with the isotope. You leave with a paperweight." David countered, his grip tightening on the silver cylinder. "I told you, it's unstable. The levels are peaking. If you try to take this through a pressurized airlock, it will vent. You'll be breathing plasma before you reach your crawler." The commander snarled and took a step forward, his hand tightening on the detonator. "I'll take my chances." The final pulse. David knew he couldn't hold the bluff much longer. He felt the cold metal of the canister vibrating. It wasn't just a bluff. The residual energy from the ALIO's flare had left a static charge in the casing. He didn't need to blow the station. He just needed to blind the commander. David jammed his thumb into the manual override recessed in the canister's base. "Close your eyes," David shouted toward the security hub. A blinding flash of violet light erupted from the canister's seams. It wasn't a lethal explosion, but a massive electromagnetic pulse. The commander's thermal goggles shrieked as they overloaded, the electronics inside frying instantly. He stumbled back, clutching his face and dropping the detonator. The steam from the pipes caught the light, turning the hallway into a glowing purple nebula. The agency arrives. The ceiling of the industrial wing suddenly groaned. The sound of the wind was replaced by the deafening, earth-shaking roar of twin-rotor heavy-lift helicopters. Powerful searchlights cut through the remaining desert haze, shining through the high observation windows. "This is Agency Command. Drop your weapons and move to the center of the hall. You are surrounded." The tactical team didn't stay to fight. Seeing their technology neutralized and the agency overhead, they scrambled back toward the maintenance hatch. The commander, still blinded and cursing, was dragged away by his subordinates. They knew when a mission was lost. The aftermath. Station Zero. Minutes later, the heavy thud of agency boots, the right ones this time, filled the station. David collapsed against the wall, the silver canister falling from his numb fingers. Sarah, Maya, and a pale but smiling Dr. Aries stepped out of the security hub. The sun finally broke through the clouds, casting a brilliant gold light over the desert. The storm was over. Station Zero was still standing, though it was leaning slightly to the west, a scarred monument to the events of the last 48 hours. Epilogue. The dust settles. As the agency medics loaded Dr. Thomas into the lead helicopter, Dr. Aries walked over to David. He looked at the wreckage of the communication tower and then at the black notebook David was still holding. "You saved more than just our lives, David," Aries said, his voice finally strong. "You saved the project. Without the isotope, those men would have turned our energy into a shadow over the world. Now, we have a chance to turn the desert green." David looked out at the vast, silent Sahara. The sand was already beginning to erase the tracks of the crawlers and the fallen tower. "I just wanted to fix the water, Doctor," David said with a tired grin. "Well," Aries replied, patting him on the shoulder, "I think you've earned a very long glass of it." The Heavylift helicopter, an Augusta Westland AW-101 with agency markings, roared as it lifted off from the shifting sands. David sat by the small, reinforced porthole, watching the metallic remains of Station Zero shrink into a tiny glinting dot amidst the vast, orange expanse of the Sahara. Beside him, Dr. Aries clutched the spent canister, his knuckles white. "You should rest, David," Sarah said, handing him a thermal blanket. She looked cleaner now, having used the onboard medical wipes to scrub the desert grime from her face. "The agency medical team says Dr. Thomas is stabilized. He's in the rear cabin with Maya." David nodded, but his mind was spinning faster than the rotors above. He looked at the agency soldiers sitting across from them. They were silent, their faces hidden behind dark visors. Their gear was pristine, too pristine for a rescue mission through a Category 5 sandstorm. "Something is wrong," David whispered, leaning toward Sarah. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice hushed by the cabin noise. "The commander back at the station. He said the agency was coming. He sounded afraid. But these guys, they didn't even look for the mercenaries. They just loaded us up and left." David noted. He pulled out the black notebook from his pocket, hidden under the blanket. "And look at their patches." Sarah squinted. The agency logo was a stylized globe, but on these soldiers' shoulders, the globe had a small, sharp lightning bolt striking through the center. It was a variation she hadn't seen in her 10 years of service. David opened the notebook to a page he hadn't fully scrutinized. Beneath a diagram of the atmospheric ionotation was a list of names. At the very top, highlighted in red, was the name, Director Vane. "Who is Vane?" David asked Dr. Aries. The old man's eyes widened. He leaned in, his voice a mere tremor. "Vane is the head of the agency's Black Site division. He was the one who funded the project initially, before the public board took over. If he sent this team, we aren't being rescued. We're being retrieved." David felt a cold pit in his stomach. He looked at the flight path monitor near the cockpit door. Instead of heading north toward the Mediterranean coast and the agency headquarters in Marseille, the digital needle was pointing southeast, deeper into the uninhabited heart of the Tibesti Mountains. "We're not going home," David said. The realization hit the group like a physical blow. They weren't being taken to safety. They were being transported to a secondary location where the project could be extracted without public oversight. Maya joined them from the back, her face pale. "David, the medical equipment in the back. It's not for recovery," she whispered. "It's for interrogation. I saw neural interface drugs in the supply lockers. They're planning to extract the final codes from Dr. Ariz's memory." David knew they had to act before they reached the mountains. He looked at the internal wiring of the cabin. Above the oxygen masks was a small maintenance panel. As an engineer, he knew that the AW-101 used a triple redundant fly-by-wire system. "If I can trip the sensors in the cargo bay," David thought, "the computer will think there's an engine fire and force an emergency landing." David calculated the required surge. To trigger the sensor without causing a real explosion, He needed to create a localized magnetic pulse using the remains of the isotope canister. "Dr. Aries, I need the canister," David whispered. "There's enough residual ionotation to short the cabin's sensor bus." "But David, we're at 5,000 meters. Sarah hissed. "If you kill the engines, we fall." "I'm not killing the engines," David replied, pulling a small copper wire from a broken headset. "I'm just lying to the pilot. When the alarm goes off, they'll have to drop the altitude and look for a landing site. That's our only chance to take the cockpit." David moved slowly, pretending to adjust his blanket. He reached the panel and pressed the wire against the canister's terminal. A small, violet spark jumped, nearly invisible in the bright cabin. Suddenly, the helicopter tilted. A harsh, electronic bleeping filled the air. Red lights began to spin in the cockpit. "Engine 2 failure. Fire in the intake." A pilot shouted. The soldiers stood up, their hands going to their weapons. "Stay in your seats." The lead soldier barked. The helicopter began a steep, stomach-churning descent. David gripped his seat, watching the desert floor rush up to meet them. He wasn't a pilot, but he knew that in 30 seconds, they would be on the ground, and the real fight would begin. The landing was anything but smooth. The pilot, believing the aircraft was on the verge of an explosion, flared the helicopter hard against a sloping sand dune near a cluster of ancient, half-buried palm trees. The impact jarred David's teeth. The rotors hit the sand with a terrifying sound, sending shards of carbon fiber into the air. Silence followed, broken only by the settling of dust and the hiss of escaping hydraulic fluid. "Out! Out! Move!" The lead soldier commanded, kicking the side door open. David didn't wait. He used the confusion to grab a heavy fire extinguisher from the wall. As the first soldier stepped out into the sand, David swung the red tank. It hit the soldier's helmet, knocking him unconscious into the dune. "Sarah!" "The other one!" David yelled. Sarah, trained in basic agency self-defense, lunged at the second guard, using the momentum of the crash to throw him off balance. Maya grabbed a medical tray and slammed it into the pilot's head as he tried to crawl out of the cockpit. Within a minute, the 4 survivors stood in the hot desert sun, surrounded by the wreckage of their rescue. The soldiers were tied up with their own plastic restraints. "Where are we?" Maya asked, shielding her eyes. Dr. Aries looked at the horizon. In the distance, a massive, obsidian-colored rock formation rose from the sand like a jagged tooth. "The Black Finger," he whispered. "We are in the forbidden zone of the Tibesti. This oasis is called the Well of Whispers." David looked at the helicopter's radio. It was smashed. They had no food, limited water, and the agency would be looking for their missing bird within the hour. "We can't stay here," David said, looking at the Black Mountain. "If Director Vane is coming, he'll start with the crash site. Aries, is there anything in that mountain?" "There is an old French colonial fort," Aries said. "But more importantly, beneath the fort, there is a secondary relay station for the Trans-African Telegraph. It was built on a natural aquifer. If we can reach it, we might find a way to broadcast the truth." The trek toward the Black Finger was grueling. The sun was at its zenith, and the heat reflected off the sand like an oven. They carried what little water they could scavenge from the helicopter's survival kits. Dr. Thomas was the hardest to move. They had fashioned a makeshift sled from a piece of the helicopter's tail rotor. As they approached the oasis, the Well of Whispers lived up to its name. The wind blowing through the dry palm fronds created a sound like 1,000 voices talking at once. "Wait," David said, stopping the group. He knelt in the sand. "Tracks." He pointed to a set of deep, wide indentations in the soft earth near the water's edge. They weren't from a vehicle or a human. They looked like massive, clawed feet. Desert monitor lizards. Maya asked hopefully. Too big. David said, his hand going to the wrench he'd kept in his belt. These are from a heavy biped. Something mechanical. Suddenly, the ground vibrated. A section of the oasis floor, disguised by sand and fake palm roots, slid open. A small, spider-like drone emerged, its red optical sensor scanning the horizon. It's a searcher. Ares hissed. The agency has been here before. This isn't just a fort, it's a graveyard for their failed experiments. David realized the Forbidden Zone wasn't just a name. It was a dumping ground for the technology the agency didn't want the world to see. The drone chirped, its light turning green as it locked onto David's heat signature. Run for the caves. David shouted. They scrambled toward the base of the Black Finger just as the drone opened fire with a series of high-frequency sonic pulses. The air around them rippled with distorted energy, shattering the dry palm trees. David felt the pressure in his ears, a warning that the whispers of the oasis were about to get a lot louder. The cave entrance was narrow and slick with moisture, a strange contrast to the parched desert outside. As they ducked inside, the sonic pulses from the drone hit the rock face, sending a rain of stone dust down on them. They scrambled deeper into the dark, the sound of the drone's mechanical chirping fading behind them. David clicked on his flashlight. The walls weren't natural stone. They were lined with polished obsidian and reinforced with ancient, rusted steel beams. This is the French fort, Sarah said, her voice echoing. But look at the architecture. This was built to withstand a nuclear blast. They followed the tunnel until it opened into a massive, underground dome. In the center sat a giant, brass-rimmed machine that looked like a Victorian version of a satellite dish. The Trans-African Relay, Dr. Ares said, walking toward it with reverence. It doesn't use radio waves. It uses the Earth's magnetic field to carry vibrations, the spectrum. David walked to the control console. It was covered in a thick layer of dust, but the vacuum tubes were still intact. If we can power this, we can send a message that no agency jammer can stop. The VLF waves will travel through the crust of the planet itself. Power? Maya asked. The generators here must have died 50 years ago. David looked at the spent isotope canister he had been carrying. He then looked at the massive brass dish. The machine is a giant inductor. If we can create a momentary surge in the local magnetic field, the same way I tripped the helicopter sensors, we can use the Earth's own rotation to generate a kickstart current. David calculated the torque required to spin the internal turbines. We need to create a massive electrical arc between the dish and the mountain's obsidian walls. The obsidian is rich in iron. It will act as a natural ground. But as David began to wire the canister to the relay, a cold, mechanical voice echoed through the dome. Identification required. Unauthorized entry detected in Sector 7. From the shadows, a second drone, much larger than the one outside, descended from the ceiling. It wasn't a searcher. It was an automated Guardian, and its twin cannons were aimed directly at Dr. Ares. The Guardian drone didn't fire immediately. It hovered in the center of the dome, its blue lights scanning the group. A holographic display flickered to life in the air between them, showing a series of complex geometric patterns and chemical equations. It's a logic lock, Maya whispered. The old agency scientists didn't trust keys. They trusted intelligence. It's asking for the missing variable in the ionization sequence. Dr. Ares stepped forward, but his hands were shaking too much to type. The variable, it's the rate of decay in a vacuum. But I can't remember the exact integer. David, you saw the notebook, Sarah shouted. David closed his eyes, visualizing the neat, small handwriting of the doctor. He remembered the page about the omega point. There had been a small number scribbled in the margin, surrounded by a circle. The number is the golden ratio. David said, stepping toward the console. Ares always said nature was the perfect engineer. He typed the numbers into the dusty keypad. The drone's red lights turned blue. The cannons retracted with a hydraulic hiss. Access granted. Welcome back, Dr. Ares. The machine began to hum. The brass dish started to rotate, the sound like a giant clock waking up after a century of sleep. The air in the dome grew heavy with static. David could feel his hair standing on end. It's working, Maya cried. The magnetic field is stabilizing. We have a connection. But their joy was short-lived. On a small radar screen at the edge of the console, a cluster of red dots appeared. They were moving fast, and they weren't drones. Director Vane is here, Ares said, his face turning pale. He's not using helicopters this time. He's using high-altitude paratroopers. They'll be on the roof of the fort in 3 minutes. David looked at the relay. How long to send the data? 5 minutes to warm up the tubes, 1 minute to broadcast. Maya replied. Then we have to hold the entrance. David said, grabbing his wrench. Sarah, take the Guardian's override. If we can't stop them with logic, we'll stop them with steel. The sound of boots hitting the stone roof of the fort echoed through the dome like thunder. David and Sarah moved to the entrance of the main tunnel, stacking old crates and rusted equipment to create a barricade. Maya, stay on that console. Don't let the signal drop. David yelled. The first flashbang detonated at the mouth of the cave, filling the tunnel with white light. David ducked, his ears ringing. Through the smoke, he saw the dark silhouettes of the agency's elite tactical unit. They moved with a terrifying, silent precision. Engage! The Guardian drone suddenly boomed. Sarah had successfully hacked the drone's targeting system. It zipped forward, firing non-lethal sonic pulses that knocked the first 3 soldiers backward. But the agency was prepared. They fired a specialized magnetic net that wrapped around the drone, short-circuiting its flight stabilizers. The Guardian crashed to the floor. Useless. David, they're coming through the vents. Sarah pointed upward. Soldiers were rappelling down from the ceiling on fast ropes. David swung his wrench at the first man to hit the ground, the impact vibrating up his arm. He wasn't a soldier, but he was fighting for his life. In the center of the room, the relay dish reached its peak speed. A brilliant blue arc of electricity jumped from the center of the dish to the obsidian walls, illuminating the dome in a strobe-like flash. Data transfer at 50%. Maya screamed over the noise of the fighting. A tall figure stepped through the smoke at the main entrance. He wasn't wearing a helmet. He wore a sharp, gray suit that looked completely out of place in the desert. His eyes were cold and calculating. Enough, the man said. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried over the roar of the machine. The soldiers stopped firing. David stood his ground, his chest heaving. Director Vane, I assume. Mr. Miller, Vane said, stepping over the fallen drone. You've been quite a nuisance. But you're an engineer. Surely you understand the beauty of this machine. Why waste it by giving it to a world that will only fight over it? Give me the canister, and I'll make sure you all have a very comfortable retirement in a place where the sun always shines. I'd rather take my chances with the desert. David replied. Director Vane smiled, a thin, mirthless line. Loyalty is a noble trait, Mr. Miller, but it's a poor shield against a bullet. He raised a small, sleek pistol, but before he could pull the trigger, the entire dome began to vibrate with a deep, subsonic hum. The brass dish was now spinning so fast it had become a golden blur. Transfer at 90%. Maya yelled. "Stop that broadcast!" Vane commanded his men. The soldiers lunged for the console, but the electrical field around the relay was now so intense that sparks were leaping from their metal weapons to the floor. One soldier was thrown back by a massive static discharge. David realized the $V_LF waves weren't just sending data. They were ionizing the very air inside the dome. He grabbed a rubber-insulated cable from the floor and threw it toward the soldiers. "Don't touch the metal," David warned his friends. The air began to glow with a pale green light. Cherenkov radiation, a byproduct of the intense magnetic flux. 100%. Maya hit the final key. The data is out. Every agency station, every news outlet, every university with a VLF receiver, they all have the formulas and the evidence of the sabotage. Vane froze. He looked at his own tablet, which was now flashing with hundreds of alerts. His secret was gone. The agency's Blacksite division was now the most famous criminal organization on Earth. "You've destroyed decades of work," Vane said, his voice trembling with rage. "I didn't destroy it," David said, stepping forward as the relay began to slow down. "I shared it. That's how science is supposed to work." Suddenly, the mountain groaned. The massive electrical surge had destabilized the ancient obsidian walls. Cracks began to spiderweb across the ceiling. "The fort is collapsing," Sarah shouted. Vane looked at the falling rocks, then at David. Without a word, he turned and ran toward the exit, followed by his remaining soldiers. He was no longer a director. He was a fugitive. "We have to go. Now." David grabbed Dr. Aries and headed for the emergency exit behind the relay. They emerged from the back of the Black Finger just as the upper levels of the French fort collapsed in a cloud of obsidian dust. The sun was setting, painting the desert in shades of deep violet and bruised gold. They were alone, exhausted, and stuck in the middle of the forbidden zone. "The agency will be hunting for Vane now, not us," Sarah said, sitting on a rock. "But we still have no way home." "Wait," Dr. Thomas said, pointing toward the dunes. A line of figures was approaching. They weren't soldiers. They were dressed in long, flowing indigo robes, riding tall, white camels. "The Tuareg," Aries whispered. "The blue men of the Sahara. They know these mountains better than any map." The leader of the nomads stopped his camel in front of David. He lowered his veil, revealing a face lined by 1,000 suns. He looked at the smoking ruins of the fort, then at the exhausted group of scientists. The mountain spoke. The leader said in a deep, melodic voice, "The whispers of the well have stopped, and a new song has begun. You are the ones who brought the lightning. We just wanted to tell the truth." David said. The leader nodded. "The truth is a heavy burden in the sand. But you have saved the spirit of the desert. Come. We have water, and we have a path that the ironbirds cannot see." As David climbed onto a camel, he looked back at the Black Finger. He still had the black notebook in his pocket. The journey was far from over, but for the first time since arriving at Station Zero, he wasn't looking for a way to fix a machine. He was looking at a world that was finally beginning to heal. The journey with the Tuareg took them deep into the hidden valleys of the Tibesti. For 3 days, they traveled by night and rested in the shadows of the canyons by day. The nomads shared their milk, their bread, and their stories. On the 4th night, they reached a hidden spring at the base of a red sandstone cliff. Dr. Aries called David over to the edge of the water. "David, I have one more thing to show you," Aries said. He held the silver canister. It was no longer glowing, but he handled it with extreme care. "I thought it was spent," David said. "The power for the relay is gone," Aries explained. "But the core, the isotope itself, It has reached a state of biotic resonance. It's no longer an energy source. It's a fertilizer. He opened the canister and poured a small amount of fine, silver dust into the spring. David watched in silence. Within minutes, the edges of the water began to change. Tiny green shoots began to sprout from the sand at a visible speed. Flowers, species that hadn't been seen in the Sahara for 10,000 years, bloomed in the moonlight. The project wasn't just about stopping storms. Aries whispered. It was about bringing the green Sahara back. This isotope is the key to life, not just power. David realized the true value of what they had protected. It wasn't just a battery. It was a seed. We can't let any government have this. David said. Not the agency. Not the UN. No one. I know. Aries said. That is why we are leaving it here, with the people who will protect it. The desert will bloom. David. One valley at a time. And the world will never know why. As they neared the edge of the Tibesti Mountains, the atmosphere changed. The peaceful silence of the nomad trek was replaced by the distant hum of jet engines. The agency wasn't gone. It was reorganizing. We are close to the Libyan border. The Tuareg leader warned. There is a checkpoint ahead. It is manned by men in grey uniforms. Vane's loyalists. Sarah said, checking her scavenged sidearm. They're blocking the only exit to the coast. David looked at the terrain. The checkpoint was in a narrow gorge called the Eye of the Needle. There was no way around it. We need a distraction. David said. Something big enough to let the camels pass through the shadows. He looked at the nomad's supply of black powder, used for their ceremonial rifles. He then looked at the remaining isotope dust in the canister. If I can create a localized ionization cloud in the gorge. David calculated. It will look like a massive sandstorm on their radar. They'll pull back to their armored vehicles. He used the black powder to create a small explosion, which kicked up a massive cloud of fine desert silt. Then, he tossed the canister into the center of the cloud. The residual charge in the canister reacted with the dust, creating a swirling, glowing vortex of sand and light. It's a ghost storm. Maya shouted. The soldiers at the checkpoint saw the massive, glowing wall of sand approaching and panicked. They scrambled for their vehicles, believing the Station Zero disaster was repeating itself. In the chaos, the Tuareg moved the scientists through the hidden paths on the canyon walls. They passed mere meters above the heads of the frightened soldiers. By the time the storm settled, the group was across the border and into the safe territory of a local research outpost. At the research outpost, David finally sat down in front of a working computer with a high-speed satellite link. The VLF broadcast from the fort had worked, better than they could have imagined. The news was everywhere. Breaking. Agency black site scandal exposed. Whistleblowers reveal weather weapon research. Director Vane wanted for crimes against humanity. Maya was crying as she read the emails from her family. Sarah was already on the phone with a legitimate agency board, arranging for a secure extraction and immunity for the team. Dr. Thomas was being loaded into a modern medical helicopter, his condition stable. Dr. Aries sat in a corner, watching the sunset, a look of profound peace on his face. David looked at his hands. They were scarred, burned, and covered in the dust of a dozen different deserts. He realized he wasn't the same man who had arrived at the airport a week ago. What now, David? Sarah asked, walking over to him. I'm going back to the oasis. David said. What? Why? To make sure it stays green. David said. And to make sure no one ever finds the rest of the isotope. He looked at the screen. The world was arguing about energy, about power, and about who to blame. But out there, in the silence of the Forbidden Zone, a garden was growing. And for David, that was the only truth that mattered. Months later, David stood on the edge of the Well of Whispers. The desert around him had changed. The dunes were still there, but they were pinned down by thick, hardy grasses and shrubs. The air felt cooler, more humid. He was no longer wearing a suit or a lab coat. He wore the indigo robes of the Tuareg. He had spent the last 90 days working with the nomads, teaching them how to maintain the solar-powered irrigation pumps he had built from the wreckage of the fort. Dr. Aries had joined him. The old man looked 10 years younger, his skin tanned and healthy. Together, they were the keepers of the green. The agency tried to send a drone last week, Aries said, walking up to the ridge. And? David asked. It got lost in the whispers. Aries smiled. The ionotation we left behind acts as a natural cloak. This valley is invisible to the world now. David looked at the black notebook. He had filled the remaining pages with new designs, not for weapons or energy, but for sustainable living in the heart of the wasteland. The Green Sahara wasn't a myth anymore. It was a reality, hidden in plain sight. The final chapter of David Miller's journey didn't end with a rescue. It ended with a beginning. He sat in the center of the new facility they had built inside the hollowed-out obsidian mountain. They called it Station 1. It wasn't a laboratory for the agency. It was a sanctuary for scientists who wanted to work for the planet, not for profit. Maya was there, running the global weather monitoring network. Sarah was the head of security, ensuring that the ghosts of the past stayed buried. Dr. Thomas had returned as the head of the medical wing, specializing in desert resilience medicine. David, the sensors are picking up a signal, Maya said, her voice full of excitement. Another storm? David asked. No. She smiled. Rain. In the middle of the Great Sand Sea. It's working. David walked to the observation deck. He looked out over the vast, transforming landscape. He realized that Station 0 had been a place of endings, the end of a secret, the end of a lie. But Station 1 was a place of hope. He picked up his wrench, the same one he had used to save the station and blind a director. He placed it on a plaque in the center of the hall. Beneath it, the inscription read, "To the engineer of life." The desert wind blew through the open vents, but it no longer sounded like whispers of fear. It sounded like a long, slow breath of a world that was finally at peace.